Sometimes it got to the point where you were even afraid to say that you were Indian. And you told your children not to because it was safer. And so there were just all these different ways of erasing Native people from the cultural landscapes.
At one point in time, it was it was a bad thing to even say you were Native American. Some people had to lie on their birth certificates and state that they were either black or that they were white. So that definitely had an effect on Native American people.
Native people have become the invisible minority here, particularly in the Northeast. The census takers, who were generally white males, made their decision about who was Indian and who was not Indian. And if you did not look Indian, then you didn't get on the census as being Indian. And so those records, whether it was talking about slavery, whether it was talking about indentured servants, it's like putting a 50 million piece puzzle together.
Well, documentary Genocide, Families, Surnames on Racial Hit List by Peter Hardin. This is a Times dispatch from the Washington Correspondent from March 5, 2000. All right. So, long before the Indian woman gave birth to a baby boy, Virginia branded him with a race other than his own. The young Monacan Indian mother delivered her son at Lynchburg General Hospital in 1971, proud of her Indian heritage. The woman was dismayed when hospital officials designated him as black on his birth certificate. All right, so her son was an Indian. She is an Indian. And what do? They still put black on his birth certificate. All right, black has no legal, weight. It means nothing. It's a crayon color. Why would they label somebody who is known Indian black? They threatened to bar his discharge unless she acquiesced. The original orders came from Richmond generations ago. Virginia's former longtime registrar of the Bureau of Vital Statistics, Dr. Walter Ashby Plecker. All right, so we got him and his story, who he was and what he did. Right, telling that they couldn't be called Indians anymore. They had to be labeled Negroes, colored, or white. All right. He believed there were no real native-born Indians in Virginia, and anybody claiming to be Indian had a mix of black blood. So anybody Indian? So why are all the Indians? Do they all look colored there? Is that why he's saying they must be black? So he's letting you know that almost everybody there is colored. All the Indians in Virginia are colored, so they must be black. They have to have some black blood. What do you mean? What does that mean, black blood? What does that mean? An aggressive pol- pol- policing the color line, policing the color line, he classified pseudo-Indians as black, even issued in 1943 a hit list of surnames belonging to mongrel or mixed blood families suspected of having Negro ancestry who must not be allowed to pass as an Indian or white. With hateful language, he denounced their tactics. Says here, quotes, like rats when you are not watching, they have been sneaking in their birth certificates through their own midwives given either Indian or white racial classification, Plecker wrote. 28 years later, the Monacan mother's surname still was on Plecker's list. She argued forcefully with hospital officials. She lost. So because he was on Plecker's list, her surname, and he had demanded, if you remember, we read the Racial Integrity Act, he demanded all hospitals, all doctors to make sure to not classify these people as Indian, right, when they were first starting. And the people he was doing the census on, they were volunteers. They were volunteering to put themselves as black or Negro. But he made sure that newborns or new people would automatically be classified that, so they wouldn't have the choice. This is what's going on in this case. All right. Today, the woman's eyes reveal her lingering pain. She consulted with civil rights lawyers and eventually won a correction on her son's birth certificate. All right. It got corrected. He ain't black. He's not black. What do you mean black power? He's not black. Just because he's of dark complexion, he's a Monacan Indian. What the mother is, right? Isn't that their own law? I don't think the prejudice will ever stop, said the woman. who agreed to talk to a reporter only on a condition of anonymity. She waged a personal battle in modern times against the bitter legacy of Plecker, who ran the bureau from 1912 to 1946, a racial supremacist. Plecker and his influential allies helped shape one of the darkest chapters of Virginia's history. It was an epic of Virginia-sponsored racism. When he perceived Indians as threats to enforcing the color line, he used the tools of his office to endeavor to crush them and deny their existence. Many Western tribes experienced government neglect during the 20th century, but the Virginia story was different. The Indians were consciously targeted for mistreatment. Plecker changed racial labels on vital records to classify Indians as colored. Aren't you colored? Ain't your ancestors and your grandparents and everybody weren't they called colored? That means they were Indians. I investigated the pedigrees of racially suspect citizens and provided information to block or annual interracial marriages with whites. He testified against Indians who challenged the law. Virginia's Indians refused to die out, although untold numbers moved away or assumed a low profile. Now, 8 surviving tribes recognized by Virginia in the 1980s are preparing to seek sovereign status from the U.S. government through an act of Congress. About 3,000 of the 15,000 Indians counted in Virginia in the 1990 census were indigenous to the state, experts say. Indigenous to the state. It's not that we're trying to dig him up and re-enter him again, said Gene Atkins, assistant chief of the Eastern Chickahominy tribe. Chickahominy. We want people to know that he did damage the Indian population here in the state, and it's taken us years, even up to now, to try to get out from under what he did. It's a sad situation, really sad, said Chief William P. Miles of the Pamunkey tribe. He came very close to committing statistical genocide on Native Americans in Virginia, and it was paper genocide. Chief G. Ann Richardson of the Rappahannock tribe spoke bluntly. Devastation, Holocaust, genocide. Those are the words I would use to describe what he did to us. She said, it was obvious his goal was the demise of all Native Americans in Virginia. We were not allowed to be who we are in our own country by officials in the government. They weren't allowing you to be who you are.
Now, War Chief Howell, if someone looked at you right now, they would say that you were African American, would they not? Now, your grandfather, though, was supposed to have been, according to records.
Well, he was.
Oh, he was the last. Well, no, but according to he wasn't the last
Right,
of the
exactly,
Nottoway of
exactly.
the Cherahaka Nottoway tribe, though. Tell us about him.
Well, my grandfather, he passed away in 1960, and I was born in 1947, and he married. It was a black woman, and they had one child, which was my mother. But I had a chance to meet him, and because I was a young fellow when he passed away. And he was kind of a quiet man. He didn't hardly say anything. And now it's coming clear as why he was so quiet, because what happened to his people. And
did he talk to you about your heritage?
No. Yeah, I used to ask my mother, I said, why is my grandfather so quiet? He never had much to say. And it's coming pretty clear to me as why he was so quiet.
Because at that time, they did not talk about being Indians because you could be jailed, correct?
Exactly.
I'm going to read from this book. It says, William Byrd's Histories of the Dividing Line Between Virginia and North Carolina, with introduction and notes by William K. Boyd, Ph.D., Professor of History, Duke University. We got this from 1929, the North Carolina Historical Commission. So we're on page 114 of this book. So this is William Byrd's account of the Nottoway Indians in the 1700s in this village of the chief's ancestors. He was telling the lady. The young men had painted themselves, right, in a hideous manner. Hideous to him, right? Not so much for ornament as terror. In that frightful equipage, they entered us with sundry war dances, all right? Just like the chief was saying, the war dances. with their painted faces and war dances, right? Wherein they endeavored to look as formidable as possible. The instrument they danced to was an Indian drum, all right, a war drum. That is a large gourd with a skin brag toward over the mouth of it. The dancers all sang to this music, keeping exact time with their feet, while their heads and arms were screwed into 1,000 menacing postures. All right, so I described the men, I was going to describe the women. Upon this occasion, the ladies had arrayed themselves in all their finery. They were wrapped in their red and blue mesh coats, all right, wrapped, thrown so negligently about them that their mahogany skins, all right, their mahogany skins appeared in several parts, just like the chief was saying, they're describing them. Indians, his people, the Nottoway, having mahogany skins. Now, you know, when you look up mahogany wood or mahogany color, what you're going to get is literally reddish brown, right? Red man, brown, reddish brown, all right? Brown, dark brown, almost like the copper color, right? Mahogany, mahogany. And this is mahogany too. Mahogany, mahogany wood color, mahogany wood. So again, you can see through their wraps, to their clothing, their red and blue coats, and you can see their mahogany skins appeared in several parts, like the Lacedaemonian damsels of old. All right, just like the Spartans. Who's the real Spartans? Future video, we're gonna break this down. Who's the real Greeks? Are people being grouped up as Greeks as well? We're gonna get into all that. It says here their hair was braided, just like the chief was saying, right? Their hair was braided with white and blue peak, and hung gracefully, and a large roll upon their shoulders. I wanted to show some other things that are in this book. We're on page 3 of this book, okay? And it says here in the bottom, the Indians are generally tall and well proportioned, which may make full amends for the darkness of their complexions. Darkness, all right, dark complexions. Add to this that they are healthy and strong, with constitutions untainted by lewdness and not enfeebled by luxury. Besides, morals and all considered, I can't think the Indians were much greater heathens than the first adventurers, who had they been good Christians would have had the charity to take this only method of converting the natives to Christianity. All right, so we got a little bit of his opinion here. All right, again, he's letting you know darkness of their complexion. All right, over on page 57 of this book, very interesting part here regarding one of the indigenous women they're referring to in this book. It says here, in the meanwhile, Shoebrush and I took a walk into the woods and called at a cottage where a dark angel, all right, a dark angel surprised us with her charms. A dark angel, huh? Her complexion was a deep copper, huh? So that her fine shape, she's so fine. A dark angel, so fine, deep copper. Her fine shape and regular features made her appear like a statue, and bronze, like a bronze statue, okay? Bronze done by a masterly hand. She was so appealing to them. You see how they're describing her? To them, she was fine shaped. Shoebrush was smitten at the first glance and examined all her neat proportions, all right? All her neat proportions with critical exactness. She struggled just enough to make her admirer more eager, so that if I had not been there, he would have been in danger of carrying his joke a little too far. Oh, man. So if the other guy wasn't there, he probably would have done something really bad to her, right? But as you guys can see again, the chief was right describing the dark angel. They couldn't resist her. Her deep copper complexion and her charms, her fine shape, and her neat proportions. So that was a few quoted paragraphs and pages from this book. Hope you guys enjoyed that. You know, this is history, primary sources. Nobody's trying to blackwash anybody, and the chief knows what he's talking about. His people, it's real history, as you guys can see.
Now, Native people, my people, were classified as mulatto. Okay. Now that was a term that not necessarily mean half white, half black, or half Indian, half white, or half Indian, half black. It was a term that the colonials created back in the early 1700s, and in reality, in many cases, it means purebred Native American. And that term mulatto, I mean, the first one was 1824, the first Racial Integrity Act, 1824, and then 1924 was the last one in Virginia that was brought about during the Pleckerism. So when you're doing genealogical searches, unless you can talk to your ancestors, your parents, your grandmothers, great grandmothers, and I tell people when I do presentations, talk to your people and ask from whence came I, so I can know how far I still have to go. Okay.
Again, North Carolina's free people of color from 1715 to 1885, Warren Eugene Miltier Jr., Louisiana State University Press, Baton Rouge. We're at the introduction of the book. It says here, in 1902, not long after the publication of a series of now famed works that included The Conjure Woman and other conjure tales, and The Wife of His Youth and other stories of the color line, Charles Waddell Chestnut sat down to pen a lesser-known article titled The Free Colored People of North Carolina for Hampton Institute's Southern Workmen. Born to parents who were free persons of color before the Civil War, Chestnut used his intimate knowledge of the population of his study along with other sources to describe the social, position, and ancestral origins of the free colored people. He wrote that status of these people prior to the Civil War was anomalous but tenable. In describing their origins, Chestnut mentioned mixtures between Negroes, whites, and Indians, all in parentheses. So-called whites, what whites, Are they really talking about pale-skinned people? What we picture today, a white person supposed to look like? Now remember the previous videos? We've gone over who free whites includes, right? It also includes the Moors and Sephardic Jews and many of the black Europeans, North Africans, etc. And I just want to remind everybody that, we're reading this great book. We're going to read some great information. And when it comes to the research that he did on his genealogy, he's on point. But when it comes to saying where the origin of all so-called Negroes is, definitely not in Africa. So a lot of the time, even though they know their own history, they still believe the out of Africa theories. So we got to dodge the hijack when we see that, when we're reading this today. So continue, it says, he argued that many free people of color, perhaps most of them, were, as we have seen, persons of mixed blood. That's him saying it. Many free people of color, if not most of them, were, as we have seen, persons of mixed blood. Again, we got to empty our cup, get rid of our prejudices and stereotypes, and know thyself truly. A careful search through court records, censuses, vital records, church minutes, wills, deeds, newspapers, pension files, and oral histories confirms a picture of life for free people of color remarkably similar to the one described by Chestnut more than a century ago. Alright, so I just want to belly flop to this part of the introduction. It says here in this part of the introduction, understanding racial categories. It is important to emphasize up front that free people of color operated in society as a category and not as a term that referred to a fixed group of people, okay? It was a category. Pay attention to what he's telling you. North Carolinians may have imagined otherwise, but the evidence in this book demonstrates that free person of color was not necessarily a label an individual carried for life. For someone to categorize another individual as a free person of color did not mean that the label became an essential part of that individual's being. Free person of color was simply a label that signaled an individual was free but not considered white. He was free, but he wasn't one of the whites. In a society dominated by an ideology that called for the acceptance of white categorization as normative. So they were trying to make the category of making people white, so-called white, a normative. North Carolinians labeled as free people of color those assumed to be free people of African descent, touch the hijack, free people of native ancestry, whom the state did not recognize as politically autonomous free persons with heritage in the East Indies, and a variety of individuals with mixed ancestry. They sometimes use free Negro, free mulatto, free musty, and free black interchangeably with free person of color. But free person of color was the most frequently used term. In addition, this seems to be the term most widely accepted by those who fell into the category. For these reasons, of color is the term I use throughout this book. All right, so before we continue, just want to mention again, he said those descended from African, right? Those are who are the free people of color. He letting you know, right, on the previous page, that it was those of African descent, which we already have debunked. What Africans? If anything, if anybody's coming from foreign and they're, of dark complexion, it would be the black Europeans that are coming over, being sent over here. Indentured servants, prisoners of war, convicts, colonists, conquistadors, those who are fleeing from religious persecution, right? Check out my previous presentation so we can understand who these people really were. So that cancels out that whole African descent. If anything, if they're talking about foreign people, they must be talking about black Europeans. And then what is the other one? Who is the free people of color other than African descent? Is free people of Native American Indians. Native American Indians. Again, which is interchangeable with free black. They're calling American Indians free blacks, free mulattoes, free Negroes.
In the year 1636 was part of that war with the Pequot tribe. The turning point was when over 300 men, women, and children were burned alive in the fort at Mystic, Connecticut. The native people that had not been slaughtered were put into slavery, and either in the other tribes who assisted the English in that war, or they were enslaved by the English themselves and sold out of the country in fairly large numbers. And they were sent to various places, and one of the favorite destinations was Bermuda. First of all, here in our own territory, if we were made slaves, we had the recourse of running away to our communities, which frequently happened, or to other communities that would give us shelter. The English found what they could not accomplish with the torch and the gun, they could accomplish with the stroke of the pen. So that's why they mislabeled our people racially in the records more and more as time went on, until eventually there was no Indian presence in the records. There was never that designation. You were identified as mulatto, musty, or any of those other terms rather than Indian.
Now we're in uncommonwealth.virginiamemory.com. So it's here the Uncommon Wealth, Voices from the Library of Virginia, archives, all right? So it's here hundreds of the descendants of Indians have obtained their freedom sues in the 18th and 19th century Virginia. All right, quick article here we're going to read. A small slip of paper on display in the Library of Virginia's latest exhibition, You Have No Right, Law, and Justice in Virginia, running 24 September 2012, 18 May 2013, all right, this is a little old, was of immense importance to 12 people. It discloses, even though it does not state the fact in so many words, that on 2 May 1772, they gained their freedom after being held in slavery, since each of them was born. The piece of paper and the fates of those Virginians illuminates a disturbing and little-known part of Virginia's history: the enslavement of American Indians. The paper came into the possession of the Library of Virginia in 1988 when it acquired a copy of Volume 2 of John Tracy Atkins' Reports of Cases Argued and Determined in the High Court of Chancery in the time of Lord Chancellor Hardwicke. London 1765 to 1768, that had once been in the library of the colonial government in Williamsburg. One of the librarians in the cataloging section showed it to me, knowing of my interest in that library. When she lifted it from her desk to hand it to me, a piece of paper that had been slipped between leaves in the middle of the volume fell out and fluttered to the floor. We were surprised, and I was even more surprised when I saw what it was. It was a 1780s or 1790s copy of the judgment in Robin versus Hardaway, or Robin or Hardaway, an unusual important case decided in the General Court of Virginia. The librarian and I presented the judgment to the archivist, who added it to the meager surviving records of the Colonial General Court. The court case had two parts. First, attorney argued about whether a 1682 law that allowed for the lifetime enslavement of Indians imported from other colonies had been repealed in 1684, 1691, or 1705. For decades, Virginia's courts had assumed that the 1684 invalidated the 1682 law, and under that persuasion, one of the attorneys informed the court hundreds of the descendants of Indians have obtained their freedom on actions brought in this court. The court concluded the first part of the case by deciding that the 1682 law had remained in effect until 1705. This decision enlarged the number of residents of Virginia who could not hope to gain their freedom by claiming to be descendants of Indian women illegally enslaved between 1684 and 1705. A jury trial then established that the 12 people were descendants of an Indian woman who had been illegally enslaved. The jury awarded Robin, Hannah, Daniel, Cuffy, Isham, Moses, Peter, Judy, Artie, Sylvia, Davy, and Ned, all of unstated age, 1 shilling in damages. Each received 1 penny, but each also received freedom. Some excellent 21st century scholarship demonstrate that English-speaking Virginians enslaved many more Indian residents of Virginia in the 17th century than earlier historians believed, all right? It wasn't Africans. Oh, they told us it was Africans, but look what they found when they started actually going into the scholarship, going into the records. Oh, actually, Indians got enslaved more than we actually believed, and that the enslavement may very well taken place in spite of the laws or in the absence of laws governing the enslavement of Indians. All right, so again, before we continue, I just want to emphasize all these court cases. We go over this in my videos, from Indigenous American to African American, a lot of different examples, and how this was going on in different states and different periods of time. So make sure to go ahead and watch those videos. If you have not, again, highly recommend it. Continuing, it says here, because almost all the records of the Colonial General Court burned in the fire that destroyed the state courthouse in much of the business district of Richmond in April 1865. Oh, how convenient that this building burned, right? How convenient they burned this building. That would prove that all these people are Indian. The specific record of the outcome of the important 1772 freedom suit naming the person's freed is especially rare and valuable. So we got the Smithsonian website, National Museum of the American Indian, all right? From the Smithsonian website, collections, right? I ain't making this up. It says here, portrait of Machapunga, Pungo River, and it says / African American woman and girl, all right? So that's the hijack. There's no African here. See? So this is the woman and the girl. I'm gonna show you the colorized version. So this is, see how. So people ask me sometimes, where you get these pictures, Kurimeo? I'm like, just got to do the research. I didn't know about the Matamuskit or Machapunga, but as soon as I knew the name, right, as soon as it came to my awareness, I found the information, I found the pics, I found everything. It all matches, all right? It all matches. That's the hijack with the African. You know why I say that? Because look, they're calling her African too, African American woman. You see what I'm saying? They're calling her African American woman. That's the hijack. They just putting words in here. This is another one. This is a Nanticoke tribe. This is a future video on all these people. Look at her. I just want to show you guys because I'm going to show you the colorized versions. All right. Portrait of a John Nanticoke woman, post wooden framework, structure of a building wearing a coat with a button on a lapel and white head scarf in Chestwood, Delaware.
from 1911 to 1914, all right? A Nanticoke indigenous girl, okay? You're gonna call her an African? No, you can't do that. That's disrespectful. You don't even know her. You don't even know her genealogy, and you don't know your genealogy. Let me show you the Nanticoke girl. Look at her. She's like, yo, take the picture. Look at her. Very confident. What's up? Portrait of a John Nanticoke girl, a member of the Thompson family, posed outdoors next to other children at clapboard building, wearing a white fabric apron and kind print plate press in Chestwood, Delaware. All right. Did they ever show you Indians like this? Did they ever show you Indians like this? On the other side of America, I just want to remind everybody, it's not just like Mongols, as people call them. These people were very dark. These are Pauieti people. All right. And I've colorized this picture, and I've shown it in my colorized pictures videos, and I have it on my Instagram. In case you guys don't know, I have an Instagram. And this is the girl, the Nanticoke girl I colorized. This is a close picture of her. These are the Machapunga Indians right here. Mata Muskit Machapunga indigenous people right here. That's her and her mom. A Matamuskit Indian girl. Matamuskit indigenous girl. An Indian from America, yes. They never showed you this in school, right? And yes, that's her mom. That's her mom right there. That's the hijack. I'm gonna go ahead and get into this book right away. It's called The Virginia Cavalcade. This is volume 33. This is from spring of 1984. All right, issue 4, volume 33, issue 4 again, if you guys want to look for it, The Virginia Cavalcade. All right, so I go to page 168 on this book, and on this chapter is called Sold into Slavery, in Retribution Against the Non-Seatical Indians by Gwenda Morgan. The arrival of Europeans in North America exacted a fearful toll of Indian lives as a result of war, massacre, famine, and disease. Nonetheless, Indians survived in significant, though not large numbers, on the Rappahannock River, after permanent English settlement began there in the late 1640s. When Old Rappahannock County was organized in 1656, there were living within its boundaries at least 4 of the tribes that Captain John Smith had identified when he explored the river in 1608. The Moraticos, the Rappahannocks, the Nanseaticos, and the Mataponis, right? When Richmond County, then comprising present-day Richmond, King George, and parts of Westmoreland counties, was created out of Old Rappahannock in 1692, only the Nanseatico tribe remained. The Nanseaticos had been one of the strongest tribes on the Rappahannock River, with at least 150 warriors in 1608. So real quick, because they were warriors, you're gonna see, they got condemned. Something really bad happened to them, and that's why today we don't know about this tribe that much. Because they were warriors. These weren't the treaty-making Indians, if you get what I'm saying. They weren't making treaties with with the settlers. In 1669, after 20 years of regular contact with English settlers, the Nanseaticos were still reputed to have 50 warriors. And yet, at the beginning of the 18th century, the entire tribe scarcely numbered above 50 men, women, and children. Between 1704 and 1706, the government of Colonial Virginia finally achieved what war, massacre, famine, and disease had failed to accomplish: the destruction of the Nanseatico Indians.
Distrust of local Indians, desire for their land, all right, again, desire for their land, fear of distant Indians who harass the frontiers, and suspicion of conspiracies among the different tribes were still deeply entrenched sentiments among white settlers in Richmond County at the beginning of the 18th century. So again, let's dodge the hijack when we see white. Let's not forget everything we've learned. We know that just because it says white, this doesn't mean these are pale skin, what we consider white today, people. Most of these people in early Virginia, especially 1600s, 1700s, most of these people, these colonists, these Europeans, these indentured servants were black folks, so-called Negroes too. So dodge the hijack with white. The murder of planter John Rowley and his family in 1704, allegedly by Nanciatico Indians, right? Allegedly. So they say allegedly, furnished the county with the most spectacular trial in its colonial history and settled its account with the Indians once and for all. In 1704, the Nanciatico Indians had appealed to the Virginia General Assembly about encroachments on their diminishing resources. All right, so the Nanciatico Indians were bringing up these protests. They were trying to do it the right way. All right, I want to emphasize that they were trying to, get the people that were supposedly in charge, right, the colonists, who were forcing these people, right, to live in certain areas and trying to take their lands and all that. They were trying to go by their rules, and they did an appeal. Say, hey man, your people are messing with us. What's up? They've taken all our resources. They're not respecting our land. They charged Thomas Kendall of Essex County with breaking down their fences and turning them off their land. You see what he was doing? Others were claiming what was left of it. The Indians did not seek the restitution of their property, but petitioned the assembly for a new land grant sufficient for their needs. The assembly ordered Attorney General Stevens Thompson to investigate their complaint and begin proceedings on behalf of the Indians if they were justified. But events soon overtook whatever help the Attorney General might have been able to render the tribe. So basically, they're not saying it here. Basically, they ignored them. When you go read about this and other stories, Wikipedia or anything like that, it'll tell you just straight up that nothing happened when they brought up their appeal. They didn't get helped at all. So they didn't care about these people. So these people were desperate. Do you understand what it is to not be able to feed your child because somebody's taking all your resources, your land? You can't even hunt, you can't go fishing. What are you forced to do? What would you do? I'm asking you right now here, what would you do? On 12th of September 1704, a letter from William Taylor, colonel of the Richmond County Militia, informed the council, hastily summoned together in Williamsburg, of the murder of Rowley and his family by Nanciatico Indians. After ranging for several days, Taylor's militiamen tracked down the alleged murderers, and captured most of the tribe. So it seems like they condemned the whole tribe for a couple of people, right? Preliminary examination revealed evidence of a brutal, ritualized killing. On the day of the murders, some 10 Indian men and youths had gathered at John Rowley's house in the upper part of the county at around 10 in the morning, their bodies painted as if for war or sport. They had deceitfully inveigled their way into the house. They then killed Rowley, his wife, his wife's mother, and his son, and mutilated their bodies. Another child, a daughter, escaped. All right, so this is again all alleged. This is what they're saying. They found the bodies like that. We were supposed to believe this and everything. But also, did they have the reason to do this? I think they probably did. We don't know what these settlers were doing to their people. Fearful that this horrid and barbarous incident signaled the beginning of a new wave of Indian unrest, the council ordered the accused brought to Williamsburg for trial and confined Virginia's other local tributary Indians to their reservations. On the frontier, the council alerted the militia to expect trouble from fleeing Nanciaticos and their presumed allies on the Rappahannock River, local settlers swooped down on the Nanciatico Indian town and destroyed it, carrying off skins, wampum, and other property belonging to the Indians. But there were no further incidents. The Indians remained quiet. The council therefore issued a special commission to have the trial of 8 Nanciatico Indians charged with the crime held at the Richmond County Courthouse rather than at the General Court in Williamsburg. Nevertheless, this was no ordinary case. The council ordered 4 of its members to attend the trial, along with the Speaker of the House of Burgesses, senior members of the neighboring county courts of Westmoreland, Stafford, and Essex, all the justices of Richmond County, and the clerks of all 4 counties. Also ordered to attend were the senior officers of each of the 4 county militias. These were to advise the members of the special court on what should be done with the rest of the tribe and any Indians who might be acquitted. The members of the special court and the militia officers were to submit their joint recommendations to the council. Also ordered to attend the trial were the interpreters of the Pamunkey, the Chickahominy, the Nottoway, the Meherrin, and Nansemond Indians. So you see who was there present on these people's trial, the other tribes' trial? Why are they there? Together with 2 or 3 of the great men of each tribe. This was to be a show trial. You hear that? Early in October, 16 judges heard the case against the Nanciaticos, 2 rather than 4 counselors, Robert Carter and John Smith, and Speaker of the House of Burgesses, Peter Beverly, sat in judgment against the accused. Other members of the court were William Taylor, Francis Wright, John Catlett, George Taylor, Samuel Peachy, William Underwood, Alexander Donovan, John Dean, David Gwynn, John Tarpley, Thomas Beale, William Robinson, and Joshua Davis. Did many videos reading a book called The Jews and Muslims of British Colonial America, showing that these colonists, a lot of these names were in that book, showing you their ethnicity, showing you how they were really, a lot of them Sephardic and Moorish Jews, crypto Muslims, Protestants, Huguenots, things like that. So make sure to catch up to those videos as well. Though the Indians pleaded not guilty, the jury decided against them. On 5th of October, the court sentenced 5 of the accused: Old Master Thomas, Bearded Jack, Jack the Fiddler. You hear that? Jack the Fiddler. This is the real Jack the Fiddler. Tom Anthony and George to be hanged. They hanged. Who were they hanging, huh? Who were they hanging? The 1920s. Who were they hanging? Nothing's changed, right? The sentence was carried out at once, right away. So as soon as they got charged, they went right outside. They hung them. 2 others, Long Tom and Young Toby, both of whom pleaded guilty, were also sentenced to die, although the court urged their reprieve because they had given evidence against their fellow tribesmen. They had snitched, huh? Did they beat them and force them to plead guilty and also snitch? For some reason, this is starting to sound like the Tituba Salem witch trials to me. Somebody being forced, right? One Indian, Frank, was acquitted. What was now to be done with the 40 or so remaining members of the tribe still in custody and under heavy guard? Why are these people so threatened by the rest of the tribe? Why are they so threatened by these people? Remember, these are warriors. These are not treaty signing Indians. The militia officers proposed a drastic solution. They resurrected an old Virginia law that, when a settler was murdered, made the Indians of the nearest town answerable for the crime with their lives or liberties. You hear that? They recommended that the surviving Indians be tried according to this act, first introduced in 1663, and if found guilty, transported out of the colony. All right, I want to remind everybody that's exactly what we went over in those videos that I was showing you guys earlier in my series From Indigenous American to African American. We read some very good scholarly, educational, primary sources telling us this. We're reading all the things that were going on at that time. You know, a lot of this stuff, again, is just excuses to move these Indians out of the way, really, especially the ones that are not compliant or signing treaties. So what happened? What were they thinking of doing? Transporting the whole tribe out of the colony. This course of action, they assured the council, would promote the future peace, quiet, and security of Virginia and meet the particular satisfaction of the inhabitants of these parts. So they're like, yeah, we'll finally be able to take over their land and nobody's going to resist or fight us. And we already got the other Indians on our side and making treaties with us. The council agreed, and the hapless Indians were passed from one set of county authorities to the next until they reached the colonial capital. There, lodged in a public jail, they endured the winter in captivity. Do you hear that? The assembly considered the Nunciaticos case in May 1705. The council and the House of Burgesses differing over what degree of guilt could be laid to the Indians' charge. The Burgesses took the view that the Indians were most likely guilty of complicity in the murders and should be removed from the colony. Most likely, right, guys? Most likely they were probably guilty in the murder too, and they're probably going to do it, or, you know, we should just remove them from the colony. I wonder what the Akamaki said about that. All those above the age of 12 whom they regarded as most dangerous should be transported to England or the West Indies, sold as servants for 7 years, and barred on pain of death from ever returning to Virginia. Do you guys hear that? They got sold into slavery. And of course, they even telling you the drop. It was actually indentured servitude. 7 years. What happened after 7 years? They were free, but they couldn't return to Virginia. They got barred. If they got caught coming back, they would be killed. So the Nunciaticos, because they were just trying to keep their land, protect the remaining members of their tribe, which was already very low from what I'm assuming the settlers did to them, because these people were warriors. We heard in the beginning, 150 warriors, and all of a sudden they had only 50 people. That doesn't mean they were all warriors. There was women, children, and everything in that. Where's the warriors? They probably had died trying to survive and fight these settlers. So again, all the tribal members who were 12 years of age or older got transported out into slavery, guys. Sold as servants to the West Indies and England. Those children who were under 12 should be bound out amongst the English, all right? They were bound out, meaning the children were made servants or bounded, right? Indentured. And they were bound out to these people, these so-called English, amongst, right? So-called English. A lot of these so-called English are actually crypto Jews, crypto Muslims. Yes, we've gone over the information. Let's not forget the previous drop. Let's talk truth and facts here. No matter feelings and emotions, guys. We got to take the good and the bad to understand true history. It's in the past. So these children were bound out to the settlers, you know, while their older family members, parents, and guardians were sent out of the colony into slavery. And they had to serve them until the age of 24 and never return to the Rappahannock River to live in another Indian town, all right? Genocide, okay? Look what they did to the Nunciaticos. So they had to do an indenture till they were 24, 25. That's a lot of years, and that was common with children under indenture servitude. We've read this in the videos I showed you guys earlier, so make sure to get those videos so you guys can see the full history of Indian slavery. The true slavery, so-called slavery, right? True slavery here. So these children were bound out all those years, right? All those years. So of course they're going to say, oh yeah, he was a slave and then he was freed by his master. So you see, a lot of the time it's not that they were freed, it's just that their indenture was over. Of course they were freed. That was already set when they got bounded out. They were to be freed when they were 24 and 25, not because their master wanted to, free them just because, and these were African slaves. You guys understand, you got to put all of this into perspective so you got to understand what really was going down. So they weren't even able to return to their ancient homeland. It's psychological. They want to make sure they killed The Indian, remember? Gotta kill the Indian out of you. Take the Indian out of you. In its treatment of the Indians, the House of Burgesses proved harsher than the council. Members of the council tried to save some of the elderly from transportation. They proposed to exclude an old Indian man, Maddox Will. That's his name, Maddox Will, and his wife, Betty, right? And attempted to set both free. They also proposed that most of the women and girls be sold not in the West Indies, but on the eastern shore of Virginia. The House of Burgesses, however, was adamant. All the adults must go, and the council ultimately agreed to the demand. Arrangements were made with Sea Captain John Martin. All right, Martin. Again, we've gone over who these peoples are based on their name and their history, their ethnicity, for the expulsion of the Indians from Virginia. Subsequently, the members of the council divided up the 13 young children of the Nanciaticos among themselves by casting lots for them. You hear that? Casting lots for them, just like in scripture. Governor Francis Nicholson took 4 children, and the other members of the council 1 each. 4 of these children were between 9 and 18 months old. Wow. These were babies. In May of 1706, 21 months after the murders, the council received a letter from John Gemans, Lieutenant Governor of Antigua in the Leeward Islands, confirming the arrival and sale of the Nanciatico Indians. All right? This was where they were sent, to Antigua, to the Caribbean, you know? And guess what they told us, guys, in history? That they were bringing so-called Negroes from Africa into Antigua. So they were being sent to Antigua, right, to the Caribbean. The small West Indian island of sugar and slaves was to be their place of permanent exile to a sugar plantation. American Indians, Nanciatico Indians, because they didn't want to make treaties and let these settlers just take their land and do whatever they wanted, they got exiled. They got sent as slaves to the sugar plantations. This is real history, not false African narratives. What became of them there is unknown. All right, what happened to them there? Let me guess, they became Negroes, right? You guys know that, right? That's what they tell us in history. What Nanciatico Indians? They never told us about this in school. They told us they were sending Africans to Antigua. You know what I'm talking about, professors. Some probably did not survive long. Others may have left descendants. Oh, others may have left descendants. Oh, you don't think so? Oh, you don't think a lot of the people in Antigua are Nanciatico Indians? Well, they are. Continuing, we're in the Case Law Access Project, Harvard Law School. We're just talking about Bud versus Rachel. This is from March 5th, 1814, Supreme Courts of Appeals of Virginia. Bud versus Rachel and others. All right, so this is the digitized form. We're going to go to a document that it actually has here. All right, and it says here Bud versus Rachel and others. It says slaves, American Indians. A Native American Indian brought into Virginia since the year 1691 could not lawfully be held in slavery here, notwithstanding such Indian was a slave in the country from which he or she was brought. This was a suit for freedom by the appellees against the appellant in the Superior Court of Law for Norfolk County. At the trial, the defendant tendered a bill of exceptions, which was signed and sealed, stating that the plaintiffs claimed their freedom upon the ground of their being the descendants of Papoose, a Native American female Indian, Papoose, who was brought into Virginia about the year 1747, and moved the court to instruct the jury that no Native American Indian brought into Virginia since the year 1691 could under any circumstance be made a slave. All right, that was law. And even if they're saying 1705, she was brought 1747, so that was even after 1705, so it's law. They shouldn't be slaves. All right, this was an Indian woman, okay? Which instruction the court did give, whereupon the defendant, who claimed to hold the plaintiffs as slaves, upon the ground that though they were alleged to be descendants of the said Papoose, a Native American Indian, the said Indian was alleged to be a slave
and held as such in the island of Jamaica. Okay? So again, when you go over those videos and you go over my Indian slavery documentaries, you'll see that American Indians from all over the Americas, not just North America, but were being sent to Jamaica. It was a major hub for Indian slavery. A lot of the sugar plantations. It wasn't Africans they were supplying this with. It was actually American Indians and black Europeans, the prisoners of war. Remember, the Jacobites were sent to plantations, all this stuff. So you guys got to remember all this. But very interesting here is that they're saying Papoose was being held in Jamaica as a slave, all right, even though she was an American Indian. So she had come in from Jamaica into Virginia in 1747, and her descendants now are fighting for their freedom, saying, hey, she was never so-called African or a slave. She was an American Indian. So by their own laws in Virginia, they could not be held as slaves. So she was held in Jamaica, it says, by the wife of Mr. Ivy, and brought by the said Ivy into Virginia as a slave. About the year 1747, moved the court to instruct the jury that a Native American Indian held in Jamaica as a slave under the laws of that island and imported into Virginia by her proprietor in that year 1746 or 1747 might be lawfully held as a slave in Virginia, notwithstanding such person was a Native American Indian, which instruction the court refused to give, to which opinion of the court the defendant accepted. Verdict and judgment for the plaintiffs, from which the defendant appealed. Wickham for the appellant. The only point in this cause arises upon the bill of exemptions, the relevancy of which cannot now be brought in question. The instruction prayed for was that no American Indian brought into this state after the year 1691 could be a slave. The court instructed the jury accordingly, notwithstanding the Indian was brought from Jamaica. This instruction, I contend, was erroneous. The 9th section of the Act of 1805, which was supposed to prevent by implication the making any Indian slaves, was only intended to establish free trade with the neighboring Indians. In the 2nd volume of Henning's Statutes at Large are several acts showing that Indians might be slaves, for the persons who could lawfully be held as such are not described as Negroes only, but as any persons not Christians. In the 1st and 2nd volumes, many laws are found prohibiting and restricting the trade with Indians, in which the words natives, savages, and Indians are indiscriminately used, as meaning the same thing. The scope and intention of the Act of 1691, although in words is established free trade with all Indians whatsoever, was plainly to do away the preceding restraining acts without contemplating foreign Indians, with whom the people of this country had no trade or connection. None of the decisions of this court have any bearing on this case. The only point decided in Jenkins versus Tom and others, first Washington 123, is that in suits for freedom, hearsay evidence concerning ancient transactions is admissible. That cause was lost for want of a regular bill of exemptions to the judge's opinion. In Coleman versus Dick and Pat, EB 233, it was decided that no American Indian could be made a slave in this state since 1705, but that foreign Indians might. 2 of the judges conceived the findings of the jury, in which it was not said whether Judith was brought in by sea or land, was insufficient. The word American in that case is ambiguous and used in its limited sense to mean Indians in that part of America, having intercourse with or neighboring to Virginia. No such word is found in any of the laws. Was not a Peruvian a Carib or native of Hispaniola a foreign Indian? 2 of the judges evidently thought it necessary to show that the Indian was brought in by land. The case, instead of being against us, is a direct authority in our favor. In Huggins versus Wrights and Palace versus Hill, the word American is used in the same restricted sense. According to those cases, no Native American Indian brought into Virginia since the year 1691 could be lawfully made a slave. But the Indian Papoose was not made a slave in Virginia, but was in that condition when brought in. Word for the appellees, the instruction given was correct. Since 1691, no Indian could be held in bondage. I do not contend merely that Indians could not be reduced into slavery, but that they could not be held as slaves. This was the plain consequence of free and open trade with all Indians whatsoever at all times and in all places, all right? So, yeah.
So there you go. They wrote that in. They can't make them slaves. It was not conferring any boon upon them, but merely acknowledging the rights which God and nature gave. All the acts before 1691 describe particular Indians such as friendly, neighboring, and other restrictive phrases. But the Act of 1691 uses the words all Indians whatsoever, all Indians, even the ones in Jamaica. Amid Mr. Wickham's construction of the word American, the Indian woman papoose is declared by the Bill of Exceptions to have been a Native American Indian, carried from this country to Jamaica and brought hither from that island. So you see that? So she was originally from North America. She was originally from North America anyway, so they had to give her freedom. They had to respect that. They were trying to make her a slave. They're like, no, but she was a slave in Jamaica, so it doesn't matter. She wasn't from here. But look at that. She was made a slave here in Virginia, probably because she was sent to Jamaica as a slave, right? As we just heard in the documentary, many Indians were being enslaved, right, and sent to the Caribbean. This was one of them. And she had made her way back to Virginia, right? Now, again, it says here, the Indian woman papoose is declared by the Bill of Exceptions to have been a Native American Indian, carried from this country to Jamaica, and brought hither from that island. We had no right to declare papoose free in Jamaica, but we had the right to say that when brought into our territory, she should be free. All right? And it's not an African, she's an American Indian from Virginia. I'm going to read real quick from this book, Travels Through the States of North America and the Provinces of Upper and Lower Canada during the years 1795, 1796, and 1797 by Isaac Welt Jr. And this was written in 1799. We go to page 375 of this book, and we got letter 35 or chapter 35, Observations on the Indians. A brief account of the persons, manners, character, qualifications, mental and corporeal of the Indians, interspersed with anecdotes. What I shall first take notice of in the persons of the Indians is the color of their skins, which in fact constitutes the most striking distinction between their persons and ours. In general, their skin is of a copper cast. Again, copper cast, right? Copper colored tribes of America, copper. There is dark copper, right? And there's light copper. But a most wonderful difference of color is observable amongst them. All right, so like I just said, many shades of that copper, even amongst the Indians. So there's dark complexion ones and there's lighter skin ones. Some in whose veins there is no reason to think that any other than Indian blood flows, not having darker complexions than natives of the south of France or of Spain, all right? And those are pretty dark people right there. While others, on the contrary, are nearly as black as Negroes. Say what? As what? As black as Negroes. They're talking about American Indians here in Lower Canada, Upper North America. Most likely Iroquois or Algonquin-speaking tribes. They're what again? They're as black as Negroes. Yeah, I'm not the one saying it. I'm not trying to make anybody so-called Negro. This is history. These are primary sources. These are people who actually was there living at that time telling you. They wrote this in the 1700s. Many persons, and particularly some of the most respectable of the French missionaries, whose long residence amongst the Indians ought to have made them competent judges of the matter, have been of opinion that their natural color does not vary from ours, and that the darkness of their complexion arises wholly from their anointing themselves so frequently with unctuous substances, from their exposing themselves to so much to the smoke of wood fires and to the burning rays of the sun. So they're trying to explain why they're so dark, you know. But although it is certain that they think a dark complexion very becoming, so they're saying that the Indians enjoy and they love their dark complexion, that they take great pains from their earliest age to acquire such an one, and that many of them do, in process of time, contrive to vary the original color very considerably. Although it is certain likewise that when first born the color differs but little from ours, yet it appears evident to me that the greater part of them are indebted for their different hues to nature alone. All right, their different hues of copper colored tribes of America. I have been induced to form this opinion from the following consideration, namely, that those children which are born of parents of a dark color are almost universally of the same dark caste as those from whom they sprang. Nekik, that is, the little otter, an Ottaway chief of great notoriety, whose village is on Detroit River, and with whom we have become intimately acquainted, listen to what they're going to say, has a complexion that differs but little from that of an African. Nekik, the little otter, the Ottaway chief has what? Complexion that differs little from that of an African, just like an African. And his little boys, who are the very image of the father, are just as black as himself. And his Indian children as well are what? So-called Negroes too. You guys hearing this? Primary source. With regard to Indian children being white on their first coming into the world, it ought by no means to be concluded from thence that they would remain so if their mothers did not bedaub them with grease, herbs, and it is well known that Negro children are not perfectly black when born, nor indeed for many months afterwards, but that they acquire the jetty hue gradually on being exposed to the air and sun, just as in the vegetable world the tender blade, on first peeping above ground, turns from white to a pale greenish color, and afterwards to a deeper green. All right, so that's any hijacks what they're trying to theorize. They're not talking about somebody being born pale skin, like a white person, pale skin, and then becoming a so-called Negro. We know that, as babies tend to be born, even in the so-called black community, lighter when they're born, and then they get darker as they, the days go by, or the months, or the years. That's natural. That's kind of what they're telling you right here. But again, they're telling you that their skins do not differ from that of an African, and that his kids were just as black as him. So-called black, right? Though I remarked to you in a former letter that the Mississaugians who live about Lake Ontario were of a much darker caste, much darker, they even darker, the Mississaugas, that's from Mississauga, Canada, okay? The Mississaugas were of much darker caste than any other tribe of Indians I met with, yet I do not think that the different shades of complexion observable amongst the Indians are so much confined to particular tribes as to particular families. For even amongst the Mississaugas, I saw several men that were comparatively of a very light color. Judging of the Creeks, Cherokees, and other Southern Indians, from what I have seen of them at Philadelphia and at other towns in the States, whither they often come in large parties, led either by business or curiosity, it appears to me that their skin has a redder tinge, all right, a redder tinge and more warmth of coloring in it, if I may use the expression, than that of the Indians in the neighborhood of the lakes. It appears to me also that there is less difference of color amongst them than amongst those last mentioned. All right, so he didn't say they were lighter. He said they were just a little redder. They're still dark, but more reddish dark, right? Amongst the female Indians also in general, there is a much greater sameness of color than amongst the men. I do not recollect to have seen any of a deeper complexion than what might be termed a dirty copper color, the women, and they're all kind of like the same, he's saying. All right, this is actually from the Lost Colony Center for Science and Research, newspaper magazine articles. I wanted to go to this one right here. All right, let's see if we can zoom in. All right. Says here, Native Americans embrace their heritage. New center will feature cultural education and lost colony research, all right? Lost colony descendants, and the Indians, Evelyn Francis, it says Washington Daily News, Washington, North Carolina. This is from September 10, 2006. Written by Christina Hale staff writer. Evelyn Francis King and her husband, William, have spent most of their life embracing their Native American ancestry in Martin County through genealogical research and area events. They did their genealogy, and guess what they found?
about their heritage, all right? You got to do your genealogy. You're telling me you got all slave ancestors and some, Kurimeo, well, some had to have come from Africa, you know. I'm like, okay, fine. Do your genealogy, find out. See how many Africans pop up. Although William King has retired as chief of the Matamuskeet Indian Coalition, Matamuskeet, who? William, this guy right here. Remember free persons of color? Remember who they were? All right, that's him. This is modern times. Modern times, you saw? All the way from 1600. You survived, brother, elder. You're not extinct. You're not extinct. He said the powers are important because they keep the people together and support coming into the community, all right? So they, I guess, they organize all these annual powwows. This year's powwow was held last month at the Williams Community Center in Williamston. The celebration was open to the public and featured authentic native dances. There was no charge for the event, and vendors sold native arts and crafts. The traditional way to start a powwow is to set up the circle, then honor the four directions of the four winds, she said. All right, this is how they do it. A person will bless the circle by walking around the burning sage and flapping smoke with a feather while a prayer is recited, all right? A prayer, while a prayer is recited. The Native American flag and the U.S. Veterans flag are brought into the area during the grand entrance dance. The veteran dance can include any veteran that served in the military regardless of what you are wearing, she said. There are many different dances, including the women's traditional one, in which female participants place jingles on their clothes, and the drum beats come together to create a significant sound. Last month's event was a day-long one. All right? Although it lasted 8 hours, the event can be called a mini powwow because traditionally the celebrations last several days, she said. Traditionally, we were powwowing, all right? Powerful powwows for days. All right, what? Giving honor, giving thanks, reciting prayers, blowing sage in the wind, right? Spiritual. This is a spiritual thing. All right? It's in your nature. I can tell by your actions and your nature how indigenous you are. And I can tell by your actions and your anger and your hate how maybe not indigenous you might be. You might be leaning to another lineage. I'm just saying. In the past, the Kings have not been able to organize a larger event because of the costs, but a new cultural center has offered to sponsor their future powwows, all right? Just want to emphasize this is Evelyn Two Braids King, all right? You see? A center for the lost colony research is in the development stages in Martin County and will feature cultures of all kinds, including the Native American culture, said Evelyn King. The idea of the center started with Fred Willard, who has been researching the lost colony for 5 years, she said. He was given an old school building in the rural community of farm life in Martin County. The Kings have been asked to be on the board for the new center. Evelyn hopes to use the 4 acres on the property for future powwows. We won't have to take the money out of our pockets. It will be sponsored by the center. My husband and I will still be instrumental in organizing the event. She hopes to use the land to display a replica of our Native American village. Who? Ours. She said ours. She's not excluding her. She said ours. That's her peoples back in the day, all right? Evelyn King has been researching Native American ancestry for 15 to 20 years. So you cannot try to say she's an African slave, all right? That's disrespectful for somebody to go and tell her, hey, no, you gotta be African somewhere. She knows her genealogy. He said the Croatan Indians didn't get lost, except to the people, all right? They never got lost, all right? Shout out to Kiowa. He got some Croatan in him. Shout out to Kiowa. Yes, sir. We migrated from the coast to the Bath and Shokowiniti area. Some look white, black, or in between. All shades. All right, all shades. He said people don't realize that Native Americans are just a mixture, but the native blood can be defined if you know your history. Relatives can look from white to dark, from white to dark. People don't realize this is her telling you. Look at her. She got relatives who are what? White and dark. She's trying to tell you, son, wake up. Stop with the colorization and all the prejudices. Evelyn King and her husband are descendants from the Matamusket tribe, going back more than 10 generations, all right? 10 generations, which originated from the Free Union community near Janesville. Both use their legal and native names. She is Two Braids and he is Whitesbear. She said native names are usually based on a person's character of personality. The name is brought forth and agreed upon by a number of people. That can be at a ceremony meeting or regular gathering. Her name was chosen to be Two Braids because she is most comfortable wearing her hair long and in two braids. She says she wears it like that just about every day. She represents, all right, except at church where she wraps it into a bun. It's just in the church, she's like, you should represent at church too, but that's an L. I'll let her do what she wants. Being Native American is something you feel, like when you hit a drum, all right? It's in your feeling, all right? Once we group meet with our brothers and sisters, we love them, all right? We love them. We don't hate them. We don't say, hey, you don't look like me. Hey, you're not, we love them. Once we meet up with our brothers and sisters, we love them. They embrace the love. We care for one another. We care for one another. That's what we're supposed to do. With a new center in the works, the Kings are looking forward to expanding their efforts in the community for sake of Native American ancestry. Their intent is to encourage the younger ones to regroup, carry on the heritage. We don't want it lost. All right? Don't want it lost. Right? Shout out to the Matamusket descendants and to the elders right there. And I just wanted you guys to see this is real life stories. It's not me making this up. All right? It's not me making this up. All right. So now I want to read from this article. It says here, from Indians to colored people, the problem of racial categories and the persistence of the Chowans in North Carolina. This is written by Warren E. Miltier Jr. And this is from the North Carolina Historical Review, Volume 93, Number 1, from January 2016, pages 28 to 57, about 30 pages. From Indians to colored people, the problem of racial categories and the persistence of the Chowans in North Carolina. Warren E. Milter Jr. In the 1677 treaty, terms transformed the Chowans from a self-governing collective into tributary reservation Indians under the authority of the colonial government. Noting the political decline of the Chowans through the 17th and 18th centuries, William S. Powell, in his time-tested narrative of North Carolina history, assumed that the Chowans were extinct by 1820. All right, they said you were extinct. They assumed. You think they only assumed, or did they do that on purpose? Paper genocide, huh? In reality, as this article shows, Chowan descendants continue to live near their homeland after this point, and few Chowan descendants still live on the lands once part of the Chowan reservation. Modern historians have overlooked Chowan persistence because the local government classified Chowan descendants as colored persons instead of Indians. Oh, wow, really? They did what? They classified American indigenous people, right? Chowan descendants, Weepemoc, the Weepemoc descendants as colored persons, so-called Negroes, instead of Indians. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries. All right? It's not me saying that. We ain't making this up. Since the late 1980s, a small group of scholars has begun to uncover the lives of Native people, documented simply as people of color.
Again, since the late 1980s, a small group of scholars has begun to uncover the lives of Native people documented simply as people of color. All right, and that group of scholars is now all of us right now. We're in this group now, and it's a bigger group now. All right, because we're researching and we're correcting history. We're seeing that there's a whole different story here that was never told to us. A lot of narratives change, and they're going to say assumed, but a lot of this was done on purpose. We already know, right? Manifest destiny and all that other stuff. Papa Boo. Oh, yeah, we got you a bull right here. Got you bull right here. People of color, and connected the histories of people categorized as Indians with those classified as colored. So it just continues, says this article builds on that work and links the legacy of the Chowan Indians to the lives of their colored descendants. Yet unlike some of these studies, this article goes beyond viewing the recategorization of the Chowans and like groups as form of documentary genocide or denial of the Indianness of Indians, and instead demonstrates that racial categories are inherently unreliable markers of social cohesion and ancestral connections. Indian, colored, and other concepts are constructs of the imagination, not cogent signifiers of human difference. All right, they're kind of saying, these are all tags really at the end of the day. As sociologists have explained, race, ethnicity, and nationality exist only in and through our perceptions, interpretations, representations, classifications, categorizations, and identifications. They are not things in the world, but perspectives on the world. Indian, in parentheses, as an imagined concept, originates from the colonial encounter and the desire to distinguish collectively the indigenous people of the Americas from Europeans. The recategorization of the Chowans from Indians to colored persons is an example of what Anne Laura Stoller describes as when common sense rubrics of racial differentiation failed to work. The Indian of Europeans' imagination simply could not encompass the variety of political and social changes that the Chowans and other native people have experienced from the colonial period through the present. Local officials in Gates County, North Carolina, the site of the Chowan Reservation, and other northeastern North Carolina localities where Chowan descendants lived, classified Chowan descendants as people of color instead of Indians for reasons related to changes in the Chowans' political status and lifeways. When Europeans first began to use Indian as a collective racial label for native peoples, they developed sets of characteristics they believed made Indians distinct from other people. In the minds of Europeans, Indians were bound to specific lands, as shown by the many maps produced during the earliest years of colonization. Map makers linked native peoples' names with certain pieces of land. As long as they remained on those lands or the reservations exchanged for those lands, European settlers believed they existed as distinct groups and maintained an essential Indian quality. In turn, native people who no longer possessed these lands could no longer be Indians under the colonizers' definition. Colonial and early national officials believed that landless Indians could not be Indians at all. You hear this? Just remember, these are all perspective of these people, right? So we're going to dodge the hijack big time. What we are clearly seeing is that they are admitting, right? What are they admitting? Indians being later classified as people of color. I know they're trying to go somewhere else with it. We gotta dodge the hijack. Remember, this is written in 2016. They're coming with their, slave narratives and their out of Africa theories too. Remember that. And that all Europeans are white. So let's dodge the hijack. Let's not forget, while I'm reading this, I know you guys are doing it, discerning the information. Without a land base, they lost the feature that distinguished them from other non-whites peoples. other non-white peoples. What are these non-white people? If they're not Indians, who are these non-white people? I know they're gonna say, well, Kurimeo, they're talking about, the Africans that were brought. No, there's other people of color there, right? That have nothing to do with so-called white. And I just wanted to show you this example here. As it says in this book here, it's actually journal or letters that were written to the Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution by J.W. Powell. He had a whole bunch of these volumes. They're called the Annual Report of the Bureau of American Ethnology. This is volume 19, or the 19th annual, as you see here, report. This comes in two parts. In part one of this, which was written in 1900, it says in some part of the book, it says, and I have the book, so I'm the one who made this image. So in regards to the contact between the two races, by which such stories could be borrowed one by the other, it is not commonly known that in all the southern colonies, Indian slaves were bought and sold, and kept in servitude, and worked in the fields side by side with Negroes up to the time of revolution. So they're saying there was Indians working in the fields, right, in all these plantations, all the way until 1776 at least. All right, so which one was the Indian and which one was the so-called black or Negro? Well, how can you tell them apart? How come? I mean, we've never seen any difference growing up, right? It's always showing us a so-called Negro as the same. All right. Continuing, it says not to go back to the Spanish period when such things were the order of the day, and they're talking about how the Spanish and Portuguese was enslaving the American Indian by the thousands, We find the Cherokee as early as 1693 complaining that their people were being kidnapped by slave hunters. Hundreds of captured Tuscarora and nearly the whole tribe of the Apalachee were distributed as slaves among the Carolina colonists in the early part of the 18th century, while the Natchez and others shared a similar fate in Louisiana. We know the whole Natchez was chained up and sent to the Caribbean. We read that in Lies My Teacher Told Us. And as late as least of 1776, Cherokee prisoners of war were still sold to the highest bidder for the same purpose. At one time it was charged against the governor of South Carolina that he was provoking a general Indian war by his encouragement of slave hunts. Furthermore, as the coast tribes dwindled, they were compelled to associate and intermarry with the Negroes until they finally lost their identity. That's how they're describing it here, but it was always you, and were classed with that race. So they're saying the Indians became the Negro. That's what they're saying here. We're classed with that race, or classified together, so that a considerable proportion of the blood of the Southern Negroes is unquestionably Indian. Again, so that a considerable proportion of the blood of the Southern Negroes is unquestionably Indian. You are Indian. It's unquestionable. Annual Report of the Bureau of American Ethnology to the Secretary of the Smithsonian Institute, Volume 19. A considerable proportion of the blood of the Southern Negro is unquestionably Indian. All right, so we're in the Encyclopedia of North Carolina, edited by William S. Powell. All right, University of North Carolina Press, used by permission of the publisher, all right? Fair use. We're just building and learning here. And it says here, the Matamusket Indians, also known as the Machapunga or Marimisket Indians, inhabited the region of present-day Hyde County at the time of the attempted settlement on Roanoke Island in the 1580s. According to explorer John Lawson, by 1701, the Matamusket Machapunga were reduced to a single village called Matamusket and numbered about 30 warriors, represented a probable total of less than 100 people. The Matamuskit were known as expert watermen. They likely became dependent on European trade, as did their neighbors. And in the years prior to the Tuscarora War, 1711 and 13, they undoubtedly witnessed their share of the clashes that were becoming frequent between the natives and the European settlers, along with Bay River Indians and the Plumlico Indians. All right. Again, remember the names of these tribes.
The Matamusket joined the lower Tuscarora, the Cori, the Wokan, and possibly other tribes in fighting against European settlers in the Tuscarora War. All right? Again, we don't just have the 5 civilized tribes. There's so many other tribes they never taught us about. They just wanted us to forget about these people. There's a specific reason for that. I hope you guys are seeing the patterns. Why? A lot of these supposed extinct tribes. Following the war, several remnant Indian bands, comprised mainly of Matamuskets and Coris, were relegated to a Matamusket reservation, an isolated tract of about 36 square miles of marsh and low ridges bordering Lake Matamusket in Hyde County. The Cori evidently did not remain long on the reservation. The Indians occupying the reservation began selling off their land to white settlers as early as 1731, and the final sale dissolving the reservation occurred in 1761. All right, again, just want to remind everybody, I know it's repetitive, but dodge the hijack. When they say white settlers, they just mean Europeans. That could include pale skin and swarthy, so-called black Europeans. All right, so they're selling land also not just to pale skinned people, but black, so-called black Europeans. Straight up, it's not always the evil white man. Sporadic references to surnames common among these Indians continued to be recorded through the 1800s, and some surnames survive in Hyde County today. And a lot of the times, we got to dodge the hijack because they say sell. It could have just easily been, people who were getting married, amalgamating, assimilating, and it was just becoming family as well. And then the land could have been lost later on. But, I just wanted you guys to know it wasn't just a white thing. The Matamusket apparently faced constant pressure from European settlers. And in 1724, Matamusket kings, John Squires, all right, and John McKee, petitioned the Colonial Council for their lands to be surveyed and conveyed as a formal grant. The grant was approved in 1727, but the actual survey seems never to have occurred. The Indians had been given 10,240 acres, but in reality, they received a considerably large number of acres in exchange for 2 buckskins and an annual quitrent of 1 shilling per 100 acres. Squires served as chief of the Matamusket from 1718 until his death in 1740s, apparently residing on a 150-acre tract of the mouth of the Matamusket Creek, later renamed Middle Creek. After Squire's death, leadership struggle appears to have occurred, with power split between several individuals. Alexander Stewart, which we read about, remember he was the one baptizing all the Indians, right? Alexander Stewart, again, Stewart, you got to prove to me this is a so-called white man. The Stuarts, the Highlanders of Scotland, these were colored people. King James, Stuart, reported after his 1761 trip to the area that Roanoke and Hatteras Indians had joined the Matamusket and were residing with them at the time. All right, you see that? Stewart baptized more than 25 Indians during his visits 1761 and 1763. The Matamusket Indians declined in number, and in 1792, entire reservation was sold for 50 pounds to a European settler. The deed was signed by 4 adult females and 3 children. All right, 3 children signed it, a deed. What really happened? A female and 3 children. Were they forced? That just sounds really weird to me. By the early 1800s, apprentice bonds, I pay attention, apprentice bonds, not slavery, apprentice bonds, indenture, right, in the contracts revealed that Matamusket Indian youth were being taught trades by European masters. Afterward, the remaining individuals with Matamusket Indian surnames were frequently referred to as free persons of color. Free persons afterwards, right? Afterwards, after they were apprenticed,
So afterwards, the remaining individuals again, with the Matamuskets, Indian surnames were frequently referred to as free persons of color. Free persons of color. So where did the color come from? If these are supposed to be white masters, where's any mention of Africans? And apprenticed as such, and also listed in the Hyde County Census records under that classification. All right, Indians labeled free person of color after they're apprenticed. Even in the late 20th century, some Hyde County families, including the Collins, the Barber, Chance, Clayton, and Bryan families, can trace their Indian heritage back to the Matamusket. All right, you had that surname.
Very much.
Now, I wanted, before we get into the details of Mr. Plecker and kind of what happened, because basically your tribe has experienced what's some called documentary genocide. Tell us a little bit about the beginning of the tribe.
Well, as you're aware, in 1912, Dr. Walter Plecker became the first director of the Bureau of Vital Statistics. Prior to that, there were no birth certificates, and he was a director up until the 1940s, 1946, until his death. But he was part of the eugenics movement, which was a movement about creating one race of people, which was white, and everything else was put in a pot, as Tina Marie would say, and stir it up and call colored. But he went beyond board on that, wherein as far as first Americans are concerned, he changed birth certificates and marriage license. He even put out letters to census takers in 1930 that people such as myself that are first Americans and Native Americans, that he considered us as being bastards, that we were just trying to be Indian to marry into the white race. What's so interesting about that was that in the 30s, he gave a presentation in New York City and on eugenics, and there were commanders associated with Adolf Hitler that attended that particular meeting.
But basically, when he was the registrar for the Bureau of Vital Records, he changed the names of Indian people in Southampton County, their race, from Indian to Negro or color.
Well, it was referred to as colored, and basically all the tribes in Virginia in the early 1900s were referred to as colored. Okay, then after the 1924 Racial Integrity Act, everything that was in that colored bowl became Negro. Okay, and that's one of the reasons why in 1968 the Supreme Court overthrew that Racial Integrity Act and gave Native Americans the right, if they were born before July 1960, to come forward to the Bureau of Indian Affairs and correct those records that had been changed.
Again, North Carolina's free people of color from 1715 to 1885, Warren Eugene Miltier Jr., Louisiana State University Press, Baton Rouge. 20th and 21st century historians have used Negro, Black, and African American instead of or in conjunction with person of color. All right, you hear that? That's a big one. So in the 20th and 21st century, which we're living right now, right, in modern times, they stopped saying free person of color. They started using tags like Negro, Black, and African American when it had nothing to do with Africans, instead of or in conjunction with person of color. Yet to embrace their usage is to accept that racial categories are fixed to specific groups of people with specific collective histories, all right? And that's not true. So you're saying if you go with that, then you're really accepting that that actually means something, like black means something, like there's actually a black people. The evolution of racial categories, however, is more complex, all right? It's way more deeper than that, than just black and white. All of these terms, especially African American, all right, in parentheses, are loaded with 20th and 21st century connotations of African ancestry, all right? It's based on theories. It's based on out of Africa theory, Darwinism, evolution. That's where they're basing that off. There is no proof. It's just 21st century connotations. They're guessing. It's conjectures. Remember what conjecture means, which do not necessarily apply to the subjects of this study or their descendants. Again, big one. Can I get a mic drop? Body bag for the illusion. We're not talking about Africans. It does not apply to the subjects or the people they're talking about in this study or their descendants. We ain't talking about African ancestry though. That's just 21st century hijack, Jesse Jackson, 80s. As this book demonstrates, not all individuals categorized as free people of color, okay, had African ancestry. I'm gonna repeat that. As this book demonstrates, not all individuals categorized as free people of color had African ancestry. Thus, your own hijacks. No, DNA, no, we already debunked that too. You can't go spit in a tube and think you're gonna find your tribe. What are you, crazy? I'm quoting Henry Gates. You have to do your genealogy. Those are scams. Those DNA tests are for entertainment only. Of course they're gonna tell you you're African. That's part of the hijack. That's part of their deception. That's part of the lies they've been telling us all our lives. They ain't gonna start telling you the truth with a DNA test. They don't promote things to tell you the truth. And they are not collectively the ancestors of people described today as blacks or African Americans, all right? And it's not me making this up. I know you guys are not blind. You guys can read with me. Listen to what he's gonna say. He's gonna agree with me what I just said. Because these people in this study, he just told you, they don't have no African ancestry. And they are not collectively, all right? I'm gonna highlight that for you too. They are not collectively the ancestors of people described today as black or African Americans. But we get a lot of Pan-Africans in the comments, you know. You guys haven't done no genealogy. I already know. And you guys are just emotional. I understand what they told you in school and what you believed all your life. But this is not about beliefs. This ain't a religion. You have a religious mind state when you're believing out of Africa theories. When people really do their genealogy like this author did, he sees that the people that are being called today black or African Americans, they don't have no African ancestry. Large numbers of people who today are the descendants of free people of color self-categorize or are classified by others as white and Indian. Okay? Making Indians white. In Virginia, I remember my past presentations on that. And when we're talking about status and not complexion, and when Negro means bondage or indentured, and white means free or a property owner, then it's a whole different game here. Again, a lot of free people of color, they self-categorize themselves or by others as white and Indian. The story of free people of color may be one of the best examples of racial categories being made and remade in American history, being made and remade again and again. You keep changing, right? You keep changing. You go from Indian, colored, Negro, black, African American, and so on and so on. Additionally, some older descendants of free people of color have explained to me that their ancestors understood black, right, so-called black to be a derogatory term. Why are you calling yourself black? Your ancestors didn't call themselves black. Derogatory term for many of them, and not one they embraced as self-descriptor. They didn't call themselves so-called black. What you mean black? These assertions are confirmed by the contrasting use of terminology between 19th century radical pro-slavery propagandists who frequently use the term black, all right? Pro-slavery propagandists. What slavery? This is a propaganda, and they started calling you and terming you black, literally to make you something that doesn't even exist. They blanked you out. You're black, all right, in their writings. And other North Carolinians who commonly use of color. I have found evidence that the category free people of color included individuals without African ancestry. He found much evidence. When you actually research, this is what you actually find. But then you also find something else, and that's a European part for a lot of people. And it wasn't whites. That's the thing. It wasn't pale-skinned people. That's what we thought before. But definitely, as he says here, without African ancestry. All right? Not Africans. We're not talking about Africans, and everybody didn't come out of Africa. These are not my theories, not my ideas. This is genealogy, primary sources, anthropology. Do the research. So let me read that back because I didn't finish the sentence. All right? It says, I have found evidence that the category free people of color included individuals without African ancestry, most notably Native peoples. Who? American Indians. What? They're being called what? Free people of color, American Indians. Scholars of Native American history have uncovered numerous examples of Native people being categorized as black. Pull up, all right? Pay attention. Scholars, people who actually do research, real scholars, not people who do vlogs on YouTube and just talk all day. Scholars of Native American history or American Indian or Indigenous history of America, the scholars of Indigenous history of America have uncovered numerous examples of American Indians being categorized as black, so-called black, colored, or mulatto. Don't talk to me about what you think you know. Show me the sources. Prove to me they're African without DNA tests, fake DNA tests. That's all you got in a movie called Roots. That's all you got. Ruth Wallace Herndon and Ella Wilcox Sikatu argued that such labeling of Native people was a form of documentary genocide. Okay? We're just talking about paper genocide. Paper genocide, yeah, that's real and it's still going on today. You keep calling yourself so-called black. Documentary genocide. So genocide in many levels and many ways, physically and in paper. I agree that such labels obscure ancestral distinctions. I also think and show, however, that racial categories have never truly acted as accurate indicators of ancestry. Whites in 19th century North Carolina were quite aware that they had branded Native people as colored. They knew what they were doing. Listen to what he's telling you. And even after such labeling retained memory, or at least they believed that certain free people of color were Native people. With this understanding, I urge scholars, I urge you, if you're listening, if you're a true scholar, to reimagine the genesis of racial categorization for American Indians in the United States, as in other parts of the Americas. All Native people did not fall into the Indian category. Some Native people lived under the designation colored, experienced the legal limitations associated with such a designation. You hear that? That status, because they were being labeled colored, now their status had changed. They had legal limitations associated with such a designation, lived in communities in which racial categorization was imposed and not self-ascribed, and described themselves as colored people while still retaining memories of their indigenous heritage. Man, this is deep right here. What did grandma tell you always? What did the grandparents and ancestors always tell you, man? She said, I'm this and I'm that. I ain't African. This is deep, man. It's sad, man, to me. It's sad, but it's beautiful at the same time. It's beautiful how we find books like this explaining everything we've been learning and proving your grandmother right. And they held on to these memories. This is deep. You can't forget. Jack D. Forbes, important but often neglected. And that's the book Africans and Native Americans, which we have read in my past videos, showed that categorization of a diversity of people, including so-called Africans, East Indians, and Native peoples as black, colored, and a host of other ambiguous color terms dates to at least the 16th century. We're talking about 1500s. Even before this point, Europeans used color to describe a diversity of people. Forbes demonstrated that racial categories had their earliest origins in attempts to describe and order human beings. I find that Negro colored, and other terms did the same work in 18th and 19th century North Carolina. North Carolinians sought to apply racial categories as descriptors of difference and as tools to organize society. In North Carolina, as in most of the European colonized world, officials use racial categories in their attempts to define status, all right? Again, in their attempts to define status of people. It was status, free white status, Negro status. Today's racial and ethnic language blurs distinctions among racial categorizations, ancestry, and culture, while attempting to ignore the historical baggage of legalized hierarchy making. We discuss whites, European Americans, and Caucasians as one people, blacks or African Americans as another, and we refer to other racialized people in a similar fashion. Just want to remind everybody, again, I'm going to keep going over it, because when you repeat things, you know, like just like in school, they make you repeat things until you take the test to see if you remember. What does free whites mean? Look what it says in the bottom about Caucasians. Free white does not mean Caucasian race, Aryan race, or Indo-European races, nor the mixed Indo-European, Dravidian, Semitic, or Mongolian peoples who inhabit Persia. And right above it, free whites again includes Moorish inhabitants of Spain and Portugal. Again, continuing, this book shows, however, that not all people of African descent are black or African American. Today, all white people are not solely of European ancestry. Hello. And not all Americans, fight Allah, fight Allah, with indigenous heritage are not Indians. Historians of the United States have rarely taken this reality into serious consideration. That's why people are so emotional with this kind of information. But the story of free people of color shows why we should. All right? Why we should. From Indians to colored people, the problem of racial categories, and the persistence of the Chowans in North Carolina. This is written by Warren E. Miltier Jr., and this is from the North Carolina Historical Review, Volume 93, Number 1. From the deed claims that the Chowans remained an Indian nation, and although the sale, like many others before it, appeared to be legal, the federal government alone was empowered to deal with Indian nations. Thus, the transaction was illegal. Again, another illegal transaction. Yet Lewis and Harrell sought to obscure the illegality of the sale by consulting with the General Assembly and seeking its approval for the sale. Obtaining approval from the state would at least meet the precedent of other land transfers approved by the North Carolina government during the colonial period, and make the state a party in any later objections to the land sale if they ever happened to come up in federal court. So they were like trying to cover their tracks. Lewis and Harrell sent a petition to the General Assembly asking for approval of the 1790 land sale in an attempt to describe the remaining Chowans as legitimate holders of the land and at the same time not truly Indians. They explained that the whole of the said Chowan Indian men is dead. They said, oh, they're all dead, leaving a parcel of Indian women which has mixed with Negroes. Now they're calling them Negroes, right? And now there is several free men and women of mixed blood, as aforesaid, which have descended from the said Indians. All right, so you see how what they're trying to do, even way back in the 1790s, in the early 1800s, they're trying to paper genocide you, and they start calling you so-called Negroes. Maybe Lewis and Harrell believed describing the Chowans such. Now they're saying mixing with Negroes. What Negroes? That could mean so many things. That could be indigenous people. That could be Sephardic Jews, Moors, Carib Indians being brought up from the Caribbean, any other indigenous person brought up from America. You know, that could mean a lot of things. So let's just, but either way,
They're trying to say they killed all the men, or what happened to the men? They just disappeared. Somebody's trying to cover their tracks and give reasons as to why it was legal for them to sell the land. So maybe Lewis and Harold, all right, so these two guys, right, they were up to science scheming. Maybe Lewis and Harold believed describing the Chowans as such would persuade the General Assembly to ignore the mandate of the federal government in transactions with Indians. Emphasizing the Chowans had mixed with Negroes would have convinced state representatives that the Chowans were no longer true Indians. Lewis and Harold's mixed blood claim was part of their strategy to dispossess the Chowans. All right, you see that? So what did they use to try to dispossess Indians? They started calling you so-called Negroes, right? Didn't that happen to all of them? Right? They started using that word to disfranchise you so you wouldn't be considered indigenous anymore, so-called Indian, indigenous, right? What? The word Negro. They started calling you Negroes. So they try to use that against the Chowans. Like, well, look, they're Negroes. They're not Indians. But that was their strategy again, to dispossess the Chowans, not necessarily an accurate reflection of the Chowans' familial patterns, for no other document supports or refutes their contention. What mixing? Mixing with who? You just saying that. What Negroes? What are you talking about? Show me the marriage records. Show me the birth certificates. Show me who they were mixing with. What are you talking about? This is exactly what they just said in this paper, right? It doesn't reflect the Chowans' familial patterns. No, they weren't doing that. For no other document support or refute their contention, all right? There's no proof of what they're saying. In 1792, the General Assembly and Governor Alexander Martin ignored federal law and approved the sale of the last pieces of the Bennett's Creek Reservation, ending the reservation period for the Chowans and setting up the rationale for the story of their disappearance. All right, that's when they started paper genocide. The deed for the land sale was the last time Gates County officials clearly defined any Chowan descendant as Indians. The final land sale signified to their neighbors that the Chowans who no longer fit the stereotype, Why? Because they changed the stereotype. They changed the way the Indian was supposed to look. They changed the stereotype so they no longer fit it. Not that they were mixing with me. They no longer fit it, meaning they were looking like it, but then all of a sudden they didn't fit it anymore. All of a sudden they didn't fit the stereotype that Indians were unequally bound to the land. Were not truly Indians, but simply colored people. They were simply colored people. Forget about the Indians. They just call them colored, okay? Okay, all right? This is a scholarly article right here. Many sources, many footnotes. All right, the North Carolina Historical Review, volume 93. What did they do? They said that you were no longer truly Indian, but simply colored people. You simply colored people. In the minds of local record keepers, the Chowans' descendants remained, but one they perceived as Indian lived in Gates County. Because here, changes in political coherence and lifeways provided local officials with their justifications to classify the Chowans of people of color instead of Indians. You hear this? Defeat in the War of 1670s made the Chowans tributaries to the royal government and forced Chowans in the early 18th century to consult with North Carolina officials in order to express grievances about settler encroachment. This is from the Matamusket Documents, a study in social history. All right, and this is 1975. So it's in the divisions of archives and history, archaeology in North Carolina by Patrick Garrow, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Says there was little to distinguish the former free persons of color and the newly emancipated blacks in Hyde County following the Civil War. All right, touch the hijack crayon colors. What blacks? What you mean by that? There was little to distinguish. All right, the former free persons of color. We just saw who was the free persons of color, right? The Matamusket, and the newly emancipated blacks in Hyde County following the Civil War. Although a few of the former free persons of color of Hyde County had received specialized training for skilled professions, remember the apprenticeship, specialized training. To me, a lot of the time, again, why would they be doing that to their slaves, right? I thought they were supposed to be working and all that. So they're training these people with actually professional skills. A lot of the time, again, and this is through your, if you guys do your genealogy, dig a little further, you might find out that these are actually family members. So most had not been taught professions that placed them in a position to successfully compete with the former slaves. Former slaves had been trained as farmers practically from birth. Oh, yeah. Oh, so they were the farmers. Oh, okay. Farmers. Growing stuff. Yeah, they were the farmers. What if that was just natural, especially if they're Indian? Indians grew and farmed, so I don't think they had to be trained to farm. So dodge the hijack. Their former masters were more likely to utilize them as tenant farmers because of that training and possibly because of the paternalistic interest in their welfare. Paternalistic. All right. See, man, I didn't know they were going to say that. Sometimes I just want to oh, man, I knew I was right. Paternalistic interest in their welfare. These are their parents. All right. These are their parents. All right. They just threw it in there. I'm not making this up. They just threw it in there. Okay. I knew it. So that's what I'm saying. We got to be careful with these narratives they give us. Once it gets to the textbooks, then they're just saying a white master had a Negro boy under slavery, and then he freed him, and then he became a free person of color. You get what I'm trying to tell you guys? A lot of the time, again, it was paternalistic interest in their welfare. They were making sure their children were taken care of in the future, giving them skills. Even if they were half Indian, that was their children. That was their children. The former free persons of color were thus placed in a disadvantaged position. They were, as a group, both illiterate and propertyless. All of the free persons of color had been classified as mulattoes in the 1850 federal census. You hear that? But were distinguished as blacks or mulattoes in the following census. Marriage between free persons of color and slaves had been prohibited by North Carolina statutes well before the Civil War. But the unlawful Negro marriages filed in the Hyde County records, and it says see Appendix 39 for an example, indicate that mixture between the two groups was indeed taking place during this period. All right, mixture was definitely going on. You got Indian in your blood. Nobody's saying you're not an Indian. It was definitely going on. All right, they have records of this. The records indicated it was definitely taking place during this period. This is history. A study of the marriage records of the McKee family of Hyde County indicate that mixture between these Matamusket descendants and blacks, all right, what blacks increased tremendously following the Civil War. A family of black McKees moved to Hyde County from South Carolina. All right, a family from South Carolina, the Black McKees. McKee's an Irish name. Remember the McKees. Yo, shout out to Topcast for the breakdown on the McKees. I got a video coming on the McKees, and it might turn out that he might be half Matamusket and half Irish. The slum landlord, the first slum landlord, the McKee. He was one of the most wealthiest so-called colored persons, so-called black persons, like in the 1900s, man. He had so much money and land. All right. Could he be possibly half Matamusket? They're saying is the so-called slave part. Is that what they're saying? Is he's half a slave? Is the Matamusket? We're gonna dig into that. So a family of black McKees moved to the Hyde County from South Carolina following the Civil War. Hyde County marriage records and personal interviews with Napoleon McKee and Jane B. McKee. This represented the first instance in which a family with the surname of McKee, who were not Matamuskets, had resided in Hyde County. Their presence, all right, they were not Matamuskets yet, you see? They're letting you know. They came from South, but they were so-called black. Black McKees. How did they become so-called black? McKees, because the McKee's an Irish name. Remember, at what point? We're going to dig into that. Their presence obscured the relationship of the contemporary McKees with the Matamuskets of that surname. These relations are further obscured by the fact that the two McKee families, there you go, sorry about that, intermarried rather freely. The two McKee families, so there was a McKee Matakusket family, you heard that? And there was a black, so-called black McKee. I think they're just, trying to add
a color there some way. They're trying to explain it some way. It says the same course of events took place in regards to other families in Hyde County who were at least partial Indian descent and culminated in complete loss of any Indian identity among those of the families. All right, so dodge the hijack. They're trying to say you became so-called black. They're trying to make you a crayon color. You lost your Indian identity because you became a crayon color. That's what they're that's what they're saying right here, man. So that's what I'm saying. Yeah, they didn't want you to know about the Madame Muse kid because it's gonna get too interesting. It's not gonna make sense with the movie Roots. It's not gonna make sense with the movie Roots. Alex Haley plagiarizing fictional books called The African. It says one family of McKays had retained firm knowledge of their partial Indian descent, although they have no awareness of the group identity of their Indian ancestors. The contemporary spokesman for this family is Napoleon Poley McKee, who resides in Fairfield, North Carolina. Napoleon McKee traces his Indian descent to his great-grandfather Benjamin McKee, who was supposedly a pure-blooded Indian. The Hyde County records do offer data concerning Benjamin McKee and his household in the 19th century. Benjamin McKee was born presumably in Hyde County between 1825 and 1830. He married Mary Jane Barber. Barber, remember, of Hyde County. 1853, Mary Jane Barber was apparently the daughter of Bartiz and Morena Barber. I'm telling you, man, I can't make this stuff up. Morena Barber, Muslim surname Morena Barber, federal census 1850, and was about 15 years old at the time of her marriage. Miss Desi Barber, granddaughter of Benjamin and Mary Jane McKee, has stated that Mary Jane McKee's mother was white. All right, what does that mean? But this was not indicated in the available records. That's not what it said. So we need the actual primary source. Who said that? Because the primary source never indicated that. It just said it right here. I'm not making it up. It says not indicated in the available records. She was not called white. Benjamin and Mary Jane McKee had 2 sons and 3 daughters, aged 1 to 7 years by 1860. But the 1870 census listed only 2 daughters remaining in the household. We're in the Smithfield Review now, volume 12, 2008. It says here, Indian Slavery and Freedom Suits, the cases of Rachel Vinnie and Rachel Finley. Although we often think of Negro slaves obtaining their freedom under certain circumstances, it is also true that some Indians, what's the difference, right? In Virginia, who were slaves, obtained their freedom. Many of them used the court system in Williamsburg, especially in the 1770s when a multitude of cases were heard. All right, a multitude of cases, many cases, hundreds. The procedures were later spelled out in the Code of Virginia, and freedom suits were mentioned in the files of the Superior Court, and local court orders, and in decided cases of the Supreme Court. This article tells the story of 2 women, residents of Southwest Virginia, who obtained their freedom through the local court systems. Rachel Vinnie in 1815 and Rachel Finley in 1820. How could slaves file a lawsuit against their master? What a great question. All right, think about that. We've saying this many times, right? We know the truth. Why, right? Because they were indentured servants. How could slaves file a lawsuit against their masters, right? If it was all about Kunta Kinte slavery. They're going to admit they don't know, but they're going to suggest a reason. It says here, continuing, in these specific cases, the exact details are missing. They don't know. They don't know how. They don't want to say. They want you to think all African slaves, right? They don't want you to know about indentured servitude and contracts. But it is known that Quakers, Methodists, and some local citizens were often willing to give assistance and encouragement. Yeah, who's the Quakers and Methodists? These were black folks too. Yes, let's not forget what we've learned in the previous presentations. If the slave could reach the courthouse, then the laws of Virginia were specific. Persons who believed that they were entitled to be free were permitted to appear before the justice of the court in the country where they lived. So now it was a regular thing. So if you thought you were free, you could just go to court? That doesn't sound like slavery to me. If the court believed there was enough evidence to hear the case, the slave was permitted to file a petition reciting the reasons for the belief. Now slaves are filing petitions and taking their masters to court. Do you guys see what we're reading? The facts of the case usually show that the individual was descended in the maternal line from an Indian brought into Virginia
and held in slavery at a time when such was illegal. Such illegal enslavements of Indians occurred repeatedly. After the case was filed, the master or owner of the slave was required to appear and post bond in an amount double the value of the petitioner. In the meantime, the slave was protected by the sheriff of the county. All court costs and attorney fees were free because the slave was usually without means and considered to be a pauper. All right, so they were even protected by the sheriff. The slaves were being protected from their masters. Does this sound like what they told you in school? I'm being real with you. You got to remember what they told you in school. It's not what they told us in school, not in my elementary school in Boston. These freedom suits were often referred to as in forma pauperius cases. Some were indexed under the word pauper or the first name of the person bringing the suit. Seldom were surnames mentioned, but the two cases that follow are exceptions. The master's bond required that there be no interference and no abuse toward the slave while the evidence was being gathered, and there was to be no prohibition from allowing the summons to be obtained. Yet in at least one instance in Southwest Virginia, the lower court refused to hear a case. Consequently, the attorney filed a right asking to transfer the case to the higher or superior court. This fact emerged from the Finlay lawsuit, where documents filed proclaimed that because a certain relative of the master was a justice on the court, it would be impossible for the case ever to be heard there. In the two specific cases mentioned in this article, one was filed in Montgomery County and the other in Whitty County, Virginia. Each of the petitioners was named Rachel, one with the surname Vinnie, the other Finley. Each had been freed by a court in Eastern Virginia, but since these records have not survived, exact details are unknown. Oh, they don't survive, huh? You burned them, you destroyed them, or you just hiding them? Even though the slaves had obtained their freedom, their masters moved them westward, where they were sold illegally as Negro slaves. Again, who? Remember, these are Indians, and they were sold as what? And illegally selling them as Negro slaves. As a result, the two Rachels had to file freedom suits to try once more to gain their freedom. They had to go to court again. You guys hear that? They already had won their freedom. Rachel Vinnie and 18 other members of her family were from Northumberland County, Virginia, and her first case was held in the District Court for Richmond, Westmoreland, Lancaster, and Northumberland, where they recovered their freedom by verdict dated September 7, 1791. In addition to their freedom, they were awarded 1 shilling in damages. These facts were recited in the case filed in Montgomery County on December 23, 1806, when for the second time Rachel filed for her freedom. The evidence showed that her ancestor was Mary, who had come into Eastern Virginia by ship with her granddaughter Bess. They were identified as Indians, not Africans. Again, I'm going to repeat that because you didn't hear. They were identified as Indians, not Africans, and were described as being of yellow complexion and had long straight hair down to their waist. Bess was a young girl of 12 or 13. No Indian tribe was mentioned. Rachel Vinnie was a child of Sarah, a descendant of these two Indian women. The case stated that she had been sold back into slavery as a Negro. She was purchased by Henry Patton, of a well-known family who lived in that part of Montgomery County that is now Pulaski County. Her petition was filed in March 1807 without fees or costs because she was classified as a pauper. She filed for trespass, assault and battery, and false imprisonment, which was the standard request in such cases. Not only was she suing for her own freedom, but she was also petitioning the court for her children, Hannah, Shanty, Jimmy, Abigail, Joe, and Solomon, all of whom were being held illegally by Henry Patton. In addition, she sued for her son Marcus, who was in the possession of Samuel Patton, a son of Henry, and her son Jupiter, who was in the possession of Andrew Johnston of Giles County. Her daughter Hannah's 3 children, Sam, Daniel, and William, were also included in the suit. After more than 8 years in the court system, all were declared to be free in 1815. In 1816, the Giles County list of free persons of color included Rachel Vinnie, age 49, then living in the New River at Phyllis Peters Place. Her occupation was listed as spinster, meaning someone who does spinning and weaving. Also in Giles County were Hannah, age 27, Jupiter, age 22, Senti or Santi, age 18, Abby, age 14, Joe, age 12, Solomon, age 10, Sam, age 7, Daniel, age 5, Bill, age 3, and Jim, age 4 months. In 1830, Jupiter, Jimmy, and Hannah were still residing in Giles County. The other Rachel, identified as Rachel Finlay, had a similar experience. She was declared to be free the first time in 1773 by the court in Williamsburg. She claimed her descent from her grandmother named Chance from the matrilineal line, who was brought into Virginia by Indian trader Henry Clay of what is now Powhatan County. All right, Indian trader, Indian slave trader. Based on uncertain evidence, Chance was approximately 6 years old and had been kidnapped by Clay somewhere in southern Indian nations. Catawba, Choctaw, and Creek were all mentioned. All right? But when you look at the place, I'm going to tell you guys now, when you understand where she got kidnapped from, when we're talking about Virginia, we're most likely talking about Catawba more than Choctaw and Creek. 2 Indian children, Chance and James, who was about 8 years old, and their progeny were raised by the Clays. The exact date of their arrival in Virginia is not known, and it is not known how soon after their arrival Henry Clay took them to the Henrico Court in August 1712 to have their ages adjudged. At this time, Indian slavery was no longer legal in Virginia, a fact ignored by the Clay family. Rachel Finlay, the granddaughter of Chance, was illegally transferred about 1773 to the frontier of Virginia by Mitchell Clay of Powhatan. She was then 20 years old, and her daughter Judy was 6. They lived in the remote parts of what is now West Virginia, at the place later known as Princeton. The following year, Rachel and Judy were sold as Negro slaves to John Draper, who lived in Draper's Valley, in that part of Whitty County that became Pulaski, all right? So again, and I want you guys to really pay attention to what I'm about to say here, and especially those who are doing genealogy and get confused when they find probates and wills, and when they're saying, oh, I give you to my daughter, my Negro slave, Henrique, whatever name they have. Because as you can see here in this article, they sold Rachel and Judy as Negro slaves to John Draper. So if you would read a probate or a will that included Rachel and Judy as Negro slaves, you would never imagine. Most people would consider automatically that these are African slaves, and that's not the case. This is something very important to look out for. And don't think these are white people who are doing this and selling the people. Again, this is indentured servitude, and they were doing this to American Indians and other unwanted Europeans. They were doing it to their own people. This is what they were doing in Europe before they got here. While with the Drapers, Rachel had 11 children, and although she attempted many times to find someone to help her get to the court 20 miles away in Whitfield, or find an attorney to help her, she did not make the trip until 1813. She was then 60 years old and had 42 descendants, many or all of whom would also be entitled to their freedom if her case succeeded. Okay? The results were not immediate because her evidence had to be gathered in Powhatan County, where the elders of the community knew her and her circumstances. Court papers show that Rachel made at least 2 trips to Powhatan to take depositions for the trial. Eventually, the case was transferred to Powhatan, and in May 1820, after 7 years in the court system, she was once again declared a free person. Do you see how much she had to fight for her freedom? Twice. The second time, man, she had to fight for all these years just to prove who she was. Not only did Rachel Finlay file her case for freedom, but 30 of her 42 descendants can be identified in various lawsuits which followed, okay? So again, you got slaves going to court and suing their masters. Lawsuits. You guys understand? That slavery narrative they gave us in school is all false. Break the spell. In addition, her youngest daughter somehow found her way to Huntsville, Madison County, Alabama, and records there show that she received her freedom based on her mother's successful lawsuit. Other members of Rachel's family were probably given to Draper children who moved west and left no local information. So meaning they probably never got freed, or they didn't find out they could be freed. They just got taken to the West without knowing what happened. The court order books mentioned those family members of Rachel who had been freed in the local courts. Their freedom was granted based on the fact that their mother or their grandmother, Rachel Finley, had been freed by the court in Powhatan. Later, the same court recognized her success when she filed for registration as a free person of color descended from an Indian named Chance. Rachel Finley's story appeared in the Journal of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society in 2003, even though earlier, right, they admitted she wasn't African. They're not Africans, but they're being called Afro-Americans, right? They got put in this book, they got tagged, they got grouped into the Afro thing. In addition, court papers filed in Withy and Powhatan counties were used as a basis of the historical novel Free in Chains, written by this author and published in 2002. Since publication of the novel, the article in the JAAHGS and the book Free People of Color, a descendant of Chance, who traced his heritage to Rachel's daughter Judy, her daughter Anne, and her daughter Melinda, had been identified and is residing in Florida. He has an extended family living in various places in the United States and is very proud of his Indian heritage and the fact that he was able to make the connection to Chance, born about 1706. The reader can only imagine what it must have been like for their two Rachels to know that they had followed the rules, gained their freedom, and then were betrayed and returned to slavery as Negroes. All right, pay attention, guys. This happened many, many times in many, many cases. You're gonna find this in the genealogy. You're gonna hit dead ends and stuff. You're gonna be weird, like, what's going on? Rachel Vinnie spent 24 years in illegal servitude after the first court case in Northumberland. It took the Montgomery County Court more than 8 years of that time to reach its decision. Rachel Finley waited 47 years for her freedom after her case was heard in Williamsburg. 7 of those years were spent waiting for the courts of Withy and Powhatan counties to act. Dreams of freedom for themselves and their many descendants must have given them patience and determination to win from real situations, real history. It was a struggle. Again, North Carolina's Free People of Color from 1715 to 1885, Warren Eugene Miltier, Jr., Louisiana State University Press, Baton Rouge. Racial categorization was ultimately a product constructed in the minds of people, all right? Racial categorization was ultimately a product constructed in the minds of people who use race as a way to frame their world. These people believed that nature, and not their minds, divided the human species into whites, Negroes, mulattoes, Indians, musties, and colored people. Yet the failure of individuals to classify the people around them consistently exposes the cognitive origins of racial categories, all right? And that's why there were so many disputes and problems and freedom suits, because it's not clear, because it's not real. You can't go off just a physical look, especially when they've lied to us about who people are in history. Various North Carolina courts records document the inconsistent use of racial categories. In 1771, the Edenton District Court clerk referred to Philip Chavis of Ensign County as a Negro, mulatto, and musty within the same set of documents for a single civil case. All right, Chavis, all right, Chavis family. Again, a lot of them are from the Siouan people, Saponi, Catawba, and they'll let you know themselves. In another example from 1795, a clerk simply referred to a man from Bertie County called John as a mulatto or Indian. He's mulatto or Indian, you know, one either or, you know, same thing. In a statement written by his attorney, this same John is labeled a free man of color. In theory, Negroes, mulattoes, musties, and Indians were supposed to be different types of people, right? They're supposed to be different people, right? But yet these same people are being classified as Negroes, as free people of color, as mulattoes, as Indians, and different records.
Even 18th and 19th century dictionaries provided the public with specific definitions of these racial terms. These examples, however, show that lines between categories in practice were poorly defined and ambiguous. Nowhere were the issues of inconsistent classification and construction of racial categories more problematic than in the case of North Carolina's indigenous people. All right? Let me repeat that. We're going to highlight it too. Nowhere were the issues of inconsistent classification, paper genocide, and the construction of racial categories more problematic than in the case of North Carolina's indigenous people. And who are these people that went through all this misclassification? Yeah, you've never heard of their tribes. By the early 19th century, most of the North Carolina's indigenous population, east of the Appalachians, became subject to shifting categorization, which has led some scholars and laypeople alike to believe that native populations of the region had disappeared. They said you disappeared and you went extinct, yet Anu was with us just the other day. He's still here. What you mean disappeared? They still here. These North Carolina tribes are still here. They're just being called so-called Negroes today, or whites. African Americans, so-called blacks. So that's the hijack. They ain't disappeared. They haven't disappeared. In reality, they were simply recategorized from Indians to colored persons, mulattoes, or Negroes, okay? In reality, that's what really happened. They're not Africans. From the colonial period into the early national era, whites began a slow process of reclassifying native people from Indians into ambiguous others, thereby eliminating the legal distinctions between a diversity of native peoples and other people classified as persons of color. From their arrival in the Americas, colonists, all right, again, who's these colonists? Stop thinking pale-skinned people. Bound native people, all right? What? Enslaved or bound them, put them in an indenture. Who? Black European colonists too. It wasn't all pale-skinned people. I really strongly believe it was more black Europeans. So colonists bound native people to certain areas of land, just as they associated their neighbors in Europe to certain territories. The earliest maps of North Carolina show territorial boundaries for each native nation that inhabited a particular area. From this point on, the colonists would associate certain land masses with particular native people, all right? That's a major one right there. That's true. You know, Indians, even though they had a main area, they didn't just stay there. They were going all over the place. They were doing trade everywhere. They didn't have boundaries. You know, like Anu was saying, his people originated in Ohio. The Sioux people they still had connections with Ohio, from Ohio to North Carolina, and all the way to the plains and to the south and everywhere else. Trade was going on. They weren't confined to a specific area. That was the Europeans who started doing that, saying, hey, you guys, this is your area. Stay right there. From this point on, the colonists would associate certain land masses with particular native people. Colonization itself, however, threatened to destroy the colonizers' system of organizing native people. Through the 17th and 18th century, the colonizers appropriated thousands of acres of native land for their own use, and thus pushed native people off the exact lands that these colonists had used to define distinct native populations. So eventually they even took those lands. We know that. Who? And it wasn't just white people. Come on, pale-skinned people. All skinfolk ain't kinfolk, and that's okay. It's just part of history, and it's in your genealogy, both sides. It's okay. Native people no longer fit definition of Indian, created during the earliest days of colonization, as native people's life ways changed from those observed by the earliest colonists, and the lands once controlled by native people were transferred to the hands of non-natives or non-Indians. In the eyes of some non-natives, these native people were no longer Indians, but simply colored people. From Indians to colored people, the problem of racial categories and the persistence of the Chowans in North Carolina. This is written by Warren E. Miltier Jr., and this is from the North
Carolina Historical Review, Volume 93, Number 1 from continuing. It says, although local officials no longer chose to categorize them as Indians, the Showans and their descendants remain in Gates County and surrounding counties, often maintained connection with King and understood they were the area's original people. As free people of color, they function within as a part of a larger society with Europeans, other free people of color, and slaves. All right, they function with all these people. All right, other people of color. What other people and what slaves? As in previous generations, 19th and 20th century Chowans continued to adapt and respond to social and environmental changes, yet their adaptations and responses never symbolized their disappearance or lessening of their connection to their ancestral past. Local officials believed that people could fit in one racial category in one moment in time and fall into another classification based on perceived changes in their behavior or political situation. You see that? You heard that? Which reveals the cognitive dimensions behind the process of racialization. All right, you got to understand what these census and records mean, you know, a lot of the time, because they're going off political situations and behaviors, perceived notions and changes. All right, the persistence of the Showans and their descendants on the various racial categories demonstrate how little these racial divisions tell us about the histories of an individual. How little. You can't base people off a word that says black, colored, or Negro. You can't base, you think you know that person is from a specific continent because you heard those three words? Come on, they're telling you right here. Communal landholding was long tested aspect of life for generations of Showans that lasted after the reservation era. In 1782, James Benjamin Patience, Sarah, and also called Sally, Nanny, also called Nancy. I think I ran into these people. Elizabeth, Darkies, and Christian, also called Kitty. Robbins, sometimes referred to collectively as the children of Nan Robbins. I swear I probably run into these people doing somebody's genealogy. They sound very familiar to me. Purchased from Henry Hill a 30-acre tract of land that became known as Indiantown, right? Indiantown. Some of these individuals, their descendants, and allied families lived on and maintained this land until 1821. A large portion of Indiantown's residents are likely represented among the 16 people counted in the household of James Robbins in the 1790 federal census, all right? The 1810 federal census best illustrates the makeup of Indiantown during the latter part of its existence. Listed sequentially are the household of George Bennett, Dorcas Robbins, Sally Robbins, John Saunders, Lewis Robbins, Nancy Robbins, Jacob Robbins, James Robbins, and Keziah Price. The census taker counted all members of these households as other free persons. Oh, other free persons, right? A category used for free non-whites. All right, you know what that means? Other free persons, otherwise so-called colored or so-called Negro or dark-skinned person, other than non-whites, not whites or non-Europeans, meaning native people, indigenous people. Is that what it means? All other free persons, indigenous people. Is that what it really means? Historical records do not reveal whether John Saunders and Keziah Price were Chowan descendants, but their families married Chowan descendants. Their presence suggests that the Chowans used Indiantown to shelter their own people as well as their allies and friends. Chowans and their descendants likely had been leaving the area since the beginning of the reservation period and resettling outside the vicinity of the reservation. The possibility also lingers that some Chowans after 1677 treaty never settled on the reservation. Evidence from surrounding counties support the hypotheses long after the disappearance of Thomas Hitter from Chowan land sales and court cases in 1740. Free people of color in Currituck, Camden, Pasquotank, and Perkins counties used the Hitter surname. Members of the Hitter family born in the late 18th century carried the first name John and Thomas, the names of Chowan leaders. A witness in 1818 case involving Abram Hitter, whose name appears in Pasquotan County, records describe him of the offspring of a white woman and an Indian. A white woman and an Indian, says here. These free people of color were likely Showan descendants. So, all right, so if she's from a white woman and an Indian, then where's the so-called black coming from? Must be from the Indian, right? If she's the white. So they're being classified as free people of color. Although their ties to the group in Gates County remains unclear, free people of color with other Showan names such as Bennett and Robbins and no documentable direct ties to the Gates County contingent appear in Currituck and Showan counties. The 1800 federal census for Currituck County presents an interesting situation in which a Samuel Robbins lived 5 households from a Rachel Bennett in what appears to be a settlement of free people of color. All right. So I just want to go to this picture real quick. Right here, you see? It says this is Andrew Jackson Robbins, a Showan descendant, was the son of Noah Robbins, one of the petitioners in the legal dispute over Indian Town. He lived in Bertie County before settling it in neighboring Hartford County during the Civil War. Andrew Jackson Robbins served with the 34th U.S. Colored Infantry. All right, Andrew Jackson Robbins served with the U.S. Colored Infantry. Photograph courtesy of the Winston family. All right, I'm going to go ahead and colorize this. All right, so this is Andrew Jackson Robbins. All right, a little bit colorized. All right, Andrew Jackson Robbins. All right, get another picture here, a little bit more enhanced. All right. But before we continue, I just wanted to go show this image right here as well of this individual right here. As you can see, it says this is Parker David Robbins, a Showan descendant, was born in Gates County in 1834. Robbins, along with his brother Augustus Robbins, left Gates County at an early age and settled in Bertie County. Both brothers served in the U.S. Colored Cavalry during the Civil War. After the war, Park and Augustus Robbins represented Bertie County in the North Carolina General Assembly. Tintype of Parker Robbins, courtesy of the North Carolina Museum of History rally. All right. Again, this is the black and white version. All right. Now let's go look at the colorized version. All right. So here's a colorized version. Go to this one right here. All right. Even during the early 20th century, Gates County residents still understood that names such as Indian Neck were attached to a people, and that the descendants of those people still lived in the vicinity. In 1905, Congress approved a creation of a fund for members of the Eastern Band of Cherokees. Thousands of claims came to the attention of Gion Miller, whose office sorted through and then approved the rejected applications, right? So they had to apply to be Cherokees. That's what I be telling people. Sometimes it could be a general term. A lot of people who weren't Cherokees eventually claimed Cherokee. Among these were over a dozen claims from individuals from Gates County, all right, Showan people. The names, these were Algonquin Showan people, right? Not Cherokees, but they were trying to get at least into the Eastern Band of Cherokees. The names Showan or Shawanoke appear to have disappeared from the collective memory of Gates County descendants. And as in many cases of people of native descent in the Southeast, the name Cherokee, all right, became their tribal affiliation. I told you, this happened to many people in the South. That's why we only got Cherokee and Blackfoot as the general, like, you know, my grandma's Cherokee or Blackfoot, but there's a broader, there could be so many things into saying Cherokee or even Blackfoot, all right? It became their tribal affiliation, but it really wasn't. Cherokee appears to have become synonymous with Indian for most 19th century North Carolinians who had long forgotten names like Showan, right? Showan, right? So what is it telling you here? Are you really Cherokee? Remember, Cherokee that word wasn't around before Europeans. Although they had no awareness of a connection to the Showan or Shawanoke names, the Showan descendants who applied for Cherokee benefits provided details of their heritage, some of which are at least partially confirmed by other documents, all right? So even though they were applying, they're like, look, we're Showan, but we need, you know, we want to be recognized at least as some native, you know? The Chowan descendants were adamant about their native heritage and provided Guion Miller with detailed information about their history. Little did they know that the stories they told were not about Cherokees but Chowans. In 1907, Betsy Smith provided an extensive genealogy going back to her father, Blake Robbins. So they were they didn't know either. Okay, so I get it. These applicants were actually, they just thought they were Cherokees, but little did they know they were actually Chowans. This is what I was saying. A lot of people think they're, Cherokee, but they could be a lot other tribes, from the East Coast. But Betsy Smith provided an extensive genealogy going back to her father, Blake Robbins, one of the petitioners in the Indiantown dispute 86 years before. She named her father's siblings, some of whom also appeared on that petition. Confident that she was a descendant of native people, Betsy expounded, "If I have failed to state any of the unnecessary things in my application, and you will let me know what is necessary, and I can of right establish the point, I shall be glad to do so." She invited the commissioner to her community to take a look at me, and aware that the word of people of color in the South was not always taken seriously, further suggested that the commissioner could confirm the facts from the white people of this county. Oh, Betsy knew that Chowan descendants as well as whites were cognizant of the histories of the native descended people in her community. I want to show her now. All right. It says Mary Emma Urey, a Chowan descendant, was the daughter of Isaac Urey, an applicant for Eastern Cherokee benefits. All right, she was applying for the Eastern Cherokee benefits, but that's because they had no other choice. She spent most of her life in the vicinity of Indiantown and the old reservation, photographed courtesy of the Urey family. All right, so here's a colorized version of Mary Emma Urey. All right, Chowan descendant, Chowan Indian descendant. Okay, a little more enhanced picture. All right, Mary Emma Urey, a Chowan Indian descendant, American Indigenous person descendant. All right. The inconsistent categorization of the Chowans and their descendants reveals the limit of using race as a tool of analysis and exploring social divides in colonial and post-colonial societies. Individuals often fall into various racial categorizations, and racial histories are nebulous. Do the Chowans and their descendants belong in the historical narratives of American Indians or African Americans, huh? The Chowan story reveals the weakness of either of these constructed narratives. The property describes the social realities. The racial categorization of the Chowans should not mitigate the importance of life stories of the Chowan's descendants who lived as colored. Scholars should continue to examine how the descendants of the Americas, pre-1492 descendants of Americans who were here pre-1492 population have dealt with colonialism, slavery, genocide, all right, and removal from their lands. Racial categorization is not a human attribute, but a reflection of human beliefs about the world. This historical reality should foreground research on all racialized peoples in order to prevent scholars from overlooking the connections and similarities among people which believe in race as reflection of social reality seeks to obfuscate. All right, the connections and similarities among people. We might be more family than you think. This is from the Matamusket Documents, a study in social history. All right, and this is 1975. So it's in the Divisions of Archives and History, Archaeology in North Carolina by Patrick Garrow. The Matamuskas and their descendants were not represented in the Hyde County records during the period in which they owned little or nothing of value that was desirable to the so-called whites, and I mean Europeans. So I get a lot of the time it's hard to find these Indians and the census and all that. A lot of the time, again, Indians didn't make it to the census. Unfortunately. And a lot of times Indians never owned land. They couldn't own land.
The Indians of Hyde County never held public office and were not even represented on tax list. All right. Who were they really doing that? Remember who they were doing that to too. Why are they treating these people like this? Therefore, little was preserved in the records concerning the Indians from the time they sold their reservation in 1761 until they sold it again in 1792. It is quite evident from the available material that the Hyde County Indians declined in both population and social cohesiveness during the second half of the 18th century. It is unlikely that much of the original Indian culture survived to 1800. There is ample evidence that this trend continued into the 19th century and was accelerated through mixture with both so-called whites and blacks, crayon colors. Matamusket descendants were not referred to as Indian after 1804 and were generally grouped with free blacks, in Hyde County under the title of free persons of color. Free persons of color. You're going to tell me that everybody that's supposed to be so-called free black or free person of color was a slave or was coming from Africa? No, not always. Sometimes they were never even slaves. They were just Indians. And yeah, not African at all. Says the policy of mass apprenticeships of the children of free persons of color, apprenticeships, not slavery, in Hyde County from 1834 to 1865 undoubtedly destroyed what vestiges of Indian culture remained among the Matamusket descendants. This effect culminated in almost total lack of Indian identity evidence by the contemporary Matamusket descendants in Hyde County. All right. So I need you guys to do your research and your genealogy if you believe that you might descend from these indigenous people, because look what they did. You see, that's paper genocide. Indians in the eastern United States who have retained their identity as Indians had histories that were significantly different from the Matamusket descendants. Very different. The Pamunkey and the Mattapony of Virginia, as examples, both retain at least portions of their reservations and much higher populations than the Matamuskets. Other groups, such as the Lumbees of Robinson County, North Carolina, although lacking knowledge of their origins, although the Lumbee don't really, that's a whole different story, retain well-developed knowledge of their Indian ancestry. They just knew they were Indian. Like, we got Indian. We know. The Lumbees never had a reservation, but do have a very large population. All right. So that's a whole different story. We're going to get into all the tribes as much as we can. I'm going to dig, make sure we get all the facts and not just, what we read here and there. And, we're going to try to see, because even I'm not the one, we know that it's like a confederation, a lot of people coming together, create the Lumbees, a lot of different indigenous people, possibly indentured servants from Europe, Swarthy Europeans, hey, it's all up in there. It's okay. That's, that's just history. That's what history says. You can't just, don't get mad at me. But definitely everywhere you see indigenous Indian tribes everywhere, and very few real Africans.